What if an entire civilization vanished from history, leaving behind only whispers in ancient texts and fragments buried beneath thousands of years of earth? Deep within the windswept grasslands north of the Black Sea lies one of archaeology's most captivating mysteries. Here, beneath layers of accumulated soil and forgotten time, researchers have uncovered evidence of a transformation so dramatic it reshaped the entire ancient world. The Cimmerians emerged from these steppes not as mere nomads, but as the architects of a military revolution that would send shockwaves across 3 continents and terrify the greatest empires of antiquity. Around 1200 BCE, something extraordinary began unfolding across the vast North Pontic steppes. The peaceful Bronze Age communities that had thrived for generations suddenly underwent a metamorphosis so complete that it defied explanation. Archaeological layers tell a story of abrupt change, where familiar pottery styles disappeared overnight, burial customs transformed beyond recognition, and entirely new technologies appeared as if from nowhere. This wasn't gradual cultural evolution, but revolutionary transformation, coinciding perfectly with the mysterious collapse of Bronze Age civilization stretching from Greece to Mesopotamia. Excavation teams working at Chernogorovka, nestled within the dramatic bend of the Dnieper River, uncovered stratified deposits that read like chapters in humanity's forgotten history. Each layer revealed startling discontinuities where established traditions ended abruptly and radical innovations began. New burial practices replaced ancient customs, unfamiliar weapon designs superseded traditional tools, and settlement patterns shifted from permanent villages to mobile camps designed for rapid movement. The archaeological evidence painted a portrait of communities preparing for something unprecedented, transforming themselves from settled farmers into mobile warriors. The metallurgical revolution accompanying this cultural shift represents one of history's most significant technological leaps. For centuries, local communities had crafted their tools and weapons from arsenical bronze and tin bronze, metals that served their needs adequately but possessed inherent limitations. The emerging Proto-Cimmerian societies rapidly mastered iron technology with an expertise that suggests either intensive experimentation or knowledge acquired through extensive contact networks. Sites like Vysokaya Mogila and Jabotin yielded iron artifacts demonstrating sophisticated understanding of carburization and quenching techniques, producing weapons with hardened edges and flexible cores that far surpassed anything their Bronze Age predecessors could manufacture. These technological innovations spread across the steppes with remarkable speed, indicating extensive communication networks linking scattered communities across hundreds of miles of grassland. The uniformity of techniques and designs suggests coordinated development rather than independent discovery, pointing to sophisticated social organization capable of transmitting complex knowledge across vast distances. This technological revolution would soon provide the Cimmerians with military advantages that made them virtually unstoppable against traditional Bronze Age armies. Settlement archaeology reveals profound changes in social organization accompanying technological innovation. Earlier Bronze Age communities had invested heavily in permanent fortifications, constructing substantial defensive works around stable villages designed for multi-generational occupation. Proto-Cimmerian sites show dramatically different priorities, with smaller, less permanent structures that could be abandoned rapidly when circumstances demanded mobility. Excavations at Belozerka-type settlements reveal communities organized around principles of flexibility and movement, with lightweight construction techniques and minimal investment in permanent infrastructure. This shift toward mobility would become the foundation of Cimmerian military supremacy, allowing armies to appear suddenly where enemies least expected them, and disappear before effective countermeasures could be organized. The archaeological record suggests these communities were deliberately preparing for a lifestyle based on movement, conquest, and adaptation to changing circumstances. Material culture emerging from this transformation period displays distinctive characteristics that would define Cimmerian identity for centuries. Horse equipment represents perhaps the most diagnostic element of Proto-Cimmerian assemblages, revealing sophisticated understanding of equine management and cavalry warfare. Bronze and iron horse bits from sites like Chernogorovka demonstrate careful engineering designed to maximize rider control, while minimizing discomfort to the mount. These bits often featured elaborate decorative elements, including stylized animal figures that reflect emerging artistic traditions, distinct from earlier steppe cultures and pointing toward the development of a unique Cimmerian aesthetic. Weapons technology demonstrates remarkable innovation and deadly effectiveness. Iron swords from Proto-Cimmerian contexts show advanced metallurgical techniques with pattern-welded blades combining hardened cutting edges with resilient cores. The characteristic Cimmerian akineks, a short sword with distinctive crossguard and pommel design, appears in archaeological contexts from this period, representing a weapon type that would eventually spread across the ancient world through Cimmerian military activities and influence weapon development from Anatolia to Central Asia. Spearheads from Proto-Cimmerian sites display sophisticated socketed construction and reinforced tangs designed for both thrusting and throwing applications, demonstrating weapons designed for versatile combat situations. The engineering reveals understanding of stress distribution and impact dynamics that suggests extensive battlefield experience-informed weapon development. Arrowheads provide particularly rich evidence for Cimmerian military culture and tactical preferences. Bronze and iron projectile points from sites like Novocherkassk show standardized production techniques suggesting organized workshops capable of mass production. Three-bladed, socketed arrowheads become increasingly common in Proto-Cimmerian contexts, representing a design optimized for penetrating armor and causing maximum tissue damage. The prevalence of arrowheads in burial context indicates that archery played a central role in Cimmerian military identity and social status, with skilled archers holding positions of respect and authority within warrior hierarchies. Burial practices during the Proto-Cimmerian period reveal complex social hierarchies and sophisticated religious beliefs. Kurgan burials become increasingly elaborate with larger mounds covering more complex internal structures designed to reflect the deceased's status and ensure proper passage to the afterlife. The burial at Vysokaya Mogila, dating to approximately 1000 BCE, contained a warrior interred with complete horse equipment, an arsenal of weapons, and imported luxury goods indicating both elevated social status and extensive trade connections reaching across continents. The practice of including horses in burials becomes more common during this period, sometimes involving multiple animals arranged around human burials in specific patterns suggesting ritual significance and beliefs about the afterlife requiring mounted transportation. These horse sacrifices represent enormous investments of wealth, indicating that Cimmerian society had developed sufficient prosperity to support such elaborate funeral practices. Gender differentiation in burial practices becomes more pronounced during the Proto-Cimmerian period, though with important exceptions that reveal flexible social structures. Male burials typically include weapons, horse equipment, and tools associated with warfare and animal husbandry, while female burials contain jewelry, textile implements, and ceremonial objects reflecting domestic and ritual responsibilities. However, some female burials include weapons, suggesting that women could achieve warrior status under certain circumstances. The burial of a female warrior at Jabotin, complete with iron sword and bronze armor elements, demonstrates that Cimmerian society allowed female participation in military activities when individual merit warranted such recognition. The geographic homeland of the Proto-Cimmerians encompassed vast steppe regions north of the Black Sea, stretching from the Dniester River westward to the Don River eastward. This territory, encompassing much of modern Ukraine and southern Russia, provided ideal conditions for developing nomadic pastoralism and horse-based warfare that would characterize Cimmerian society. The region's river systems, including the Dnieper, Dniester, and Don, provided crucial water sources and transportation routes facilitating communication and trade across the steppes. Archaeological evidence suggests different Cimmerian groups occupied distinct territorial zones within this broader homeland, each developing regional characteristics while maintaining overall cultural unity. Western Cimmerians centered in the Dniester-Dnieper region show stronger connections to Carpathian and Danubian cultural traditions, while eastern groups near the Don River display closer relationships with Caucasian and Central Asian influences. These regional variations would have important implications for later Cimmerian military campaigns and political organization, as different groups specialized in warfare against particular types of enemies and terrain. The flourishing Proto-Cimmerian world that had dominated the North Pontic steppes for nearly 4 centuries was about to face an existential catastrophe that would shatter their civilization forever. From the distant eastern horizons beyond the furthest reaches of Cimmerian influence, A new force was gathering strength that would unleash devastation across the ancient world. These weren't merely another nomadic tribe seeking better pastures, but Iranian-speaking confederations wielding revolutionary military capabilities and organizational structures that would redefine warfare itself. The Scythians had arrived, and their westward expansion would trigger one of history's greatest population upheavals. The emergence of Scythian dominance represented far more than tribal conquest or territorial expansion. Archaeological excavations at sites like Ajan in Tuva and Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains have revealed burial complexes of staggering complexity dating to the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, demonstrating that Scythian society had evolved sophisticated hierarchical structures capable of mobilizing unprecedented resources and manpower. These monumental burial mounds contained elaborate horse sacrifices, with some complexes displaying over 160 horses, arranged in intricate patterns around central burial chambers, their bodies positioned according to precise ritual requirements that must have taken enormous coordination to execute. The scale and precision required for such monuments reveals that emerging Scythian confederations possessed administrative capabilities and social unity that surpassed anything previously witnessed on the steppes. These weren't spontaneous tribal gatherings, but highly organized political entities with established chains of command, specialized roles, and the ability to coordinate complex operations across vast territories. The archaeological evidence suggests a society that had mastered not only warfare but also logistics, engineering, and ceremonial organization on an unprecedented scale. Scythian military innovations incorporated several breakthrough technologies that provided overwhelming advantages over traditional Cimmerian warfare methods. The composite recurve bow, constructed from precisely layered horn, wood, and sinew components, delivered significantly enhanced range and armor-penetrating capability compared to earlier designs. These weapons represented masterpieces of engineering, with each component carefully selected and processed to optimize performance. Scythian arrowheads from 8th century contexts display standardized three-bladed socketed designs optimized for maximum penetration, manufactured in quantities suggesting centralized production facilities operating with industrial efficiency. Iron-scale armor fragments recovered from Scythian archaeological sites indicate sophisticated metallurgical knowledge and organized workshops capable of equipping large military formations with standardized protective equipment. The uniformity of design and construction quality suggests established production centers with skilled craftsmen working to consistent specifications, enabling entire armies to be equipped with superior defensive equipment that gave them decisive advantages in close combat situations. Scythian horse culture represented a revolutionary advancement in steppe warfare capabilities. While Cimmerians had certainly mastered mounted combat, Scythian innovations in breeding programs, training methodologies, and tactical deployment created military advantages that proved insurmountable in direct confrontation. Skeletal analysis from Scythian sites indicates selective breeding programs that produced larger, more robust horses capable of carrying armoured riders across extended distances while maintaining speed and manoeuvrability. These weren't merely transportation animals, but carefully bred war machines optimised for battlefield performance. Bit designs recovered from Scythian contexts show mechanical improvements that provided superior control during complex battlefield manoeuvres, enabling coordinated cavalry tactics that could overwhelm traditional Cimmerian fighting methods through superior discipline and tactical flexibility. The archaeological evidence suggests Scythian cavalry could execute sophisticated formations and coordinated movements that allowed smaller forces to defeat larger but less organized opponents. The political organization of emerging Scythian confederations differed fundamentally from Cimmerian tribal structures, providing crucial advantages in sustained military campaigns. While Cimmerian society remained organized around relatively autonomous clan groups, with loose confederate arrangements suitable for raiding and local conflicts, Scythian political development emphasized centralized authority under paramount chiefs capable of coordinating military campaigns across continental distances. This organizational superiority enabled Scythian forces to concentrate overwhelming numbers at decisive points, while maintaining strategic coordination across multiple theaters of operation simultaneously. Archaeological evidence from the Dnieper Bend region documents the violent transformation of Cimmerian settlements during the 8th century BCE with disturbing clarity. Excavations at traditional Cimmerian sites reveal destruction layers containing arrowheads of distinctly Scythian manufacture, burned structures, and hastily abandoned material culture suggesting desperate flight rather than organised withdrawal. The site of Jabotin shows unmistakable evidence of violent destruction around 720 BCE, with human remains displaying trauma patterns consistent with battlefield injuries inflicted by Scythian weapons. Weapons caches buried during this period suggest that Cimmerian communities attempted to preserve military equipment for future resistance efforts, though archaeological evidence indicates most were never recovered, implying that the original owners never returned or survived to reclaim their hidden arsenals. The desperation evident in these hasty concealments reveals communities that understood their traditional way of life was ending but still hoped for eventual recovery. The mounting pressure from Scythian expansion created cascading destabilization throughout Cimmerian society that went far beyond military defeat. Traditional grazing territories that had supported Cimmerian pastoral economies for generations became contested zones where military strength alone determined access to crucial resources necessary for survival. The disruption of established seasonal migration patterns forced Cimmerian groups to compete among themselves for increasingly limited territorial bases, further weakening overall resistance to Scythian pressure and creating internal conflicts that made coordinated defence impossible. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Cimmerian communities attempted to adopt Scythian military technologies and tactical approaches, but these efforts proved insufficient to counter the overwhelming demographic and organisational advantages of the eastern invaders. The material record shows hybrid weapon designs and modified equipment that demonstrate Cimmerian efforts to adapt, but the continued pattern of destruction indicates these adaptations fail to provide effective defence. Herodotus provides the most comprehensive ancient account of the Scythian-Cimmerian conflict, though his narrative requires careful scholarly analysis to distinguish reliable historical information from later mythological embellishments and political propaganda. According to his account in the histories, the Scythians originated from regions beyond the Araxes River and migrated westward under demographic pressure from the Massagetae. Upon reaching territories north of the Black Sea, they encountered Cimmerian populations and demanded either submission or territorial concessions that would have effectively ended Cimmerian independence. When Cimmerian leadership rejected these demands, military conflict became inevitable, though the outcome was predetermined by Scythian advantages in organisation, technology, and numbers. The reliability of Herodotus' sources regarding these events presents significant challenges for modern scholarship. Writing in the 5th century BCE, approximately 2 centuries after the main Scythian-Cimmerian conflicts, Herodotus relied primarily on oral traditions transmitted through multiple generations of informants, whose accuracy and objectivity remain questionable. His primary sources included Scythian nobles, who possessed obvious incentives to present their ancestors' actions in favourable terms, as well as Greek colonists from the Black Sea region, whose knowledge derived from local traditions of uncertain reliability and potential bias. However, certain elements of Herodotus' account correspond convincingly with archaeological evidence and provide valuable insights into historical processes. His description of Scythian military superiority, particularly in cavalry tactics and archery capabilities, corresponds closely to material evidence recovered from 8th century archaeological sites. His account of Cimmerian leadership disputes during the crisis period finds support in archaeological evidence suggesting fragmentation of traditional political structures and breakdown of established authority systems. The geographic details he provides regarding battle locations and migration routes generally correspond to topographic features and archaeological site distributions, lending credibility to his basic narrative framework. Herodotus describes devastating internal divisions among Cimmerian leadership regarding appropriate responses to Scythian pressure, conflicts that proved as destructive as external military threats. According to his account, some Cimmerian nobles advocated armed resistance despite clearly unfavourable odds, believing that honour demanded fighting regardless of consequences, while others promoted strategic withdrawal to preserve tribal survival for potential future recovery. This leadership crisis allegedly culminated in armed conflict between Cimmerian factions, with the war party ultimately prevailing, but at the catastrophic cost of further weakening already inadequate resistance capabilities. The archaeological record strongly supports Herodotus's general narrative of Cimmerian political fragmentation during this critical period. Burial practices at Cimmerian sites show increasing variation in grave goods and monument construction, suggesting breakdown of traditional status hierarchies and resource distribution systems that had maintained social stability for centuries. The appearance of weapon caches and hastily constructed fortified positions indicates preparation for prolonged conflict and desperate attempts to create defensible positions against superior forces. Evidence of hasty abandonment at multiple sites suggests that organized resistance ultimately proved unsustainable against Scythian military superiority, forcing mass population movements that would reshape the demographics of 3 continents and bring Cimmerian warriors into contact with civilizations from Anatolia to Assyria. The forced exodus of Cimmerian populations from their ancestral steppelands created one of history's most complex migration patterns, sending waves of displaced warriors across 3 continents in a desperate search for new territories they could claim through conquest. These weren't organized military expeditions, but desperate flights of entire communities carrying their families, livestock, and sacred objects, while fighting running battles against both pursuing Scythians and hostile populations blocking their escape routes. Each migration stream developed its own character, shaped by the specific circumstances of their departure, the routes they followed, and the civilizations they encountered along their journey toward uncertain sanctuary. The Western migration stream, comprising communities from the Dniester-Dnieper region, chose the treacherous path through Carpathian mountain passes toward the Danube Valley, and eventually into Thrace and western Anatolia. This route required negotiating with established mountain populations who viewed the approaching Cimmerians as potential threats rather than refugees seeking passage. Archaeological evidence from Georgian sites reveals complex political arrangements that sometimes involved military alliances against common enemies, suggesting that some Cimmerian groups achieved temporary integration with local power structures through marriage alliances, tribute arrangements, or mutual defense agreements. Excavations at elite burial sites throughout Georgia show distinctive Cimmerian metalwork and horse equipment appearing in local contexts, indicating that skilled Cimmerian craftsmen and warriors found employment with regional rulers who valued their military expertise and technological innovations. These arrangements provided temporary security for some Cimmerian refugees while introducing their superior weapons technology and tactical knowledge to local military establishments, creating hybrid fighting forces that combined Cimmerian mobility with local knowledge of terrain and political conditions. The southern migration stream followed ancient trade routes through Caucasus passes, utilizing established pathways to reach the highlands of eastern Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia. This journey brought Cimmerian communities into contact with sophisticated urban civilizations that possessed wealth worth plundering, but also military capabilities that could destroy careless raiders. The route demanded careful navigation of complex political relationships between competing kingdoms, each seeking to exploit Cimmerian military prowess, while avoiding the devastating consequences of harboring enemies of more powerful neighbors. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout the Caucasus region documents the gradual transformation of Cimmerian material culture as communities adapted to new environments and incorporated local technologies and artistic traditions. Pottery assemblages show progressive changes in decorative motifs and vessel forms, reflecting cultural adaptation and intermarriage with local populations. Metalwork displays hybrid characteristics combining traditional Cimmerian designs with regional techniques and materials, suggesting workshops where displaced craftsmen collaborated with local artisans to produce new forms of weapons and ornamental objects. The Eastern Migration Stream, comprising communities from territories closest to the original Scythian expansion, faced the most direct military pressure and experienced the most traumatic displacement. Some groups from this region moved southeastward through Central Asian routes, eventually reaching regions as distant as the Iranian plateau where they encountered Persian and Median populations, establishing their own territorial claims. Others attempted to maintain positions in marginal territories unsuitable for Scythian pastoral economies, leading to fundamental changes in subsistence strategies and social organization that transformed their traditional way of life. These eastern migrants were forced to develop new survival techniques suited to environments ranging from desert oases to mountain valleys, abandoning their traditional reliance on large-scale pastoralism for more diversified economic strategies. Archaeological evidence suggests some groups adopted semi-sedentary lifestyles, combining limited agriculture with specialized crafts production, while others became professional mercenaries selling their military skills to regional powers competing for territorial control. Each migration stream carried distinct cultural characteristics reflecting their regional origins within the broader Cimmerian homeland, creating diversity within unity as scattered populations maintained core identity while adapting to radically different circumstances. Western migrants preserved stronger connections to European metallurgical traditions and artistic styles, producing weapons and ornaments that showed clear stylistic relationships to Carpathian and Danubian cultural developments. Southern migrants demonstrated greater willingness to adopt sedentary agricultural practices when circumstances required permanent settlement, developing hybrid economies that combined pastoral and farming elements. Eastern migrants retained more traditional steppe pastoral practices despite environmental constraints, maintaining their emphasis on horse culture and mobility, even when forced to operate in territories poorly suited to large-scale nomadism. Their adaptation strategies emphasized maintaining military effectiveness rather than economic optimization, reflecting their more precarious strategic situation and constant threat from pursuing Scythian forces. The timing of these massive population movements varied considerably across different regions and communities, with some groups departing their traditional territories at the first indication of Scythian pressure, while others maintained desperate resistance until direct military defeat forced immediate abandonment of ancestral lands. Archaeological dating indicates that the Western migration commenced as early as 740 BCE, suggesting that some Cimmerian leaders possessed sufficient strategic foresight to recognize the futility of resistance against superior Scythian forces. Southern routes experienced major population movements continuing into the early 7th century BCE, indicating that some communities attempted to maintain their homeland positions longer before accepting the necessity of exile. This extended time frame created complex interactions between different waves of Cimmerian migrants and their new neighbours, as earlier arrivals had to compete with later refugees for territorial access and political accommodation. The prolonged nature of these displacements created opportunities for military leaders to assume greater political authority within Cimmerian communities, as traditional clan-based leadership structures proved inadequate for coordinating complex military movements and negotiating with foreign powers. Archaeological evidence suggests that successful war chiefs accumulated personal followings that transcended traditional kinship boundaries, creating new forms of political organization based on demonstrated military achievement rather than hereditary status or ritual authority. This transformation represented a fundamental shift from traditional Cimmerian social organization toward more centralized leadership structures better suited to the demands of sustained military campaigning in hostile territory. The most successful leaders were those who could provide both military protection and successful negotiations with potential allies or enemies, skills that differed substantially from the ceremonial and pastoral management abilities valued in traditional steppe society. Military organization during the migration period required fundamental adaptations to new strategic circumstances that challenged every aspect of traditional Cimmerian warfare. Traditional fighting methods had emphasized territorial defense and seasonal raiding from established bases with familiar supply sources and escape routes, but migration warfare demanded unprecedented mobility, logistical flexibility, and the ability to fight effectively across unfamiliar terrain against unknown enemies using diverse tactical systems. Archaeological evidence indicates that Cimmerian military equipment became increasingly standardized during this period, with emphasis placed on portable weapons and equipment suitable for extended campaigns where resupply opportunities were unpredictable and repair facilities unavailable. This standardization represents conscious adaptation to the realities of sustained military operations far from traditional support systems, prioritizing reliability and maintainability over specialized optimization for particular tactical situations. The social disruption caused by forced migration created revolutionary changes in Cimmerian community structure, as traditional relationships based on kinship, territorial attachment, and established hierarchies dissolved under pressure of constant movement and military necessity. Survival depended increasingly on individual competence and group cohesion, rather than inherited status or ritual authority. creating opportunities for capable individuals to achieve leadership positions regardless of their traditional social standing. This transformation accelerated during the most dangerous phases of migration, when military effectiveness became the primary determinant of group survival and successful adaptation to new environments. Communities that maintained rigid traditional structures often failed to adapt quickly enough to changing circumstances, while those that embraced more flexible organization under proven military leaders achieved better outcomes in terms of both survival and eventual territorial establishment. The forced displacement of Cimmerian populations from their ancestral steplands initiated a cascade of military pressures that fundamentally altered the political landscape across the ancient Near East, bringing nomadic warrior culture into direct collision with the most sophisticated urban civilizations of the era. As these battle-hardened warrior bands moved southward through Caucasus passes, they encountered the northern frontiers of the Neo-Assyrian Empire at the height of its territorial expansion and administrative sophistication. This collision between nomadic Cimmerian military culture and Assyrian imperial administration produced some of the most detailed contemporary documentation of steppe warfare tactics and their devastating impact on sedentary civilizations, providing modern historians with unprecedented insight into the military revolution that nomadic peoples brought to ancient warfare. The psychological devastation inflicted by Cimmerian raids on Assyrian territorial administration created cascading crises that extended far beyond immediate battlefield casualties, fundamentally undermining the economic and social foundations upon which imperial power depended. Local populations throughout frontier regions began abandoning agricultural settlements and commercial centres at the mere rumour of Cimmerian activity in their vicinity, triggering massive disruptions to tax collection and tribute payments that formed the essential economic backbone of imperial administration. This wasn't simply military defeat, but systematic erosion of the administrative apparatus that enabled the Assyrian Empire to function across its vast territories. Assyrian provincial governors desperately requested additional garrison forces and enhanced defensive fortifications from the imperial capital, but the extraordinary mobility of Cimmerian raiders rendered static defensive measures largely ineffective against enemies who could appear suddenly, strike devastating blows, and vanish before relief forces could respond. Traditional fortress systems designed to control territorial boundaries and protect established trade routes proved useless against warriors who avoided predictable approaches and refused to engage in conventional siege warfare. Assyrian intelligence operations regarding Cimmerian political organization revealed complex leadership structures that differed fundamentally from the centralized monarchies typical of Near Eastern kingdoms, creating diplomatic challenges that imperial administrators struggled to comprehend. Rather than following orders from a single paramount ruler who could negotiate binding agreements, Cimmerian warbands operated under multiple leaders who coordinated their activities through informal consultation and shared strategic objectives that could change rapidly, based on battlefield circumstances and emerging opportunities. This decentralized command structure made it extraordinarily difficult for Assyrian diplomats to negotiate meaningful agreements or arrange tribute arrangements that would ensure peaceful relations, since no single leader possessed authority to speak for all Cimmerian forces or guarantee compliance with negotiated terms. The traditional Assyrian diplomatic toolkit, developed through centuries of dealing with conventional kingdoms, proved utterly inadequate for managing relationships with nomadic confederations operating under fundamentally different political principles. The economic devastation caused by Cimmerian military activities on established Near Eastern trade networks created catastrophic effects throughout the region that extended far beyond immediate raid damage. Major commercial routes connecting Mesopotamian markets with Anatolian metal sources and Black Sea trade networks faced constant disruption from Cimmerian attacks, forcing merchants to seek alternative pathways that significantly increased transportation costs and delivery times, while reducing profit margins to unsustainable levels. Assyrian customs records from this period document substantial decreases in luxury goods, imports, and corresponding dramatic increases in military expenditures for convoy protection and frontier defense, revealing how nomadic warfare could undermine imperial prosperity even without direct territorial conquest. The empire found itself spending increasing resources on defensive measures while receiving decreasing revenues from disrupted commercial activities, creating a fiscal crisis that weakened imperial capabilities precisely when maximum military strength was needed. Cimmerian military success against established kingdoms derived partly from their sophisticated ability to exploit political divisions and territorial disputes among sedentary populations, demonstrating strategic intelligence that surpassed mere tactical competence. Rather than treating all settled peoples as uniform enemies to be destroyed or conquered, Cimmerian leaders demonstrated remarkable understanding of local political dynamics, forming temporary alliances with kingdoms opposed to Assyrian expansion while simultaneously conducting devastating raids against Assyrian territories and tributary states. This political flexibility enabled relatively small Cimmerian forces to achieve strategic impact, far exceeding their numerical strength by leveraging existing tensions and conflicts to their advantage. They could present themselves as liberators to populations oppressed by Assyrian rule, while simultaneously terrorizing Assyrian allies, creating complex political situations that imperial administrators found extremely difficult to manage through conventional diplomatic or military responses. The adaptation of Cimmerian military tactics to diverse geographical environments demonstrated remarkable tactical sophistication that allowed them to maintain military effectiveness across the varied landscapes of Anatolia and the Caucasus. In open terrain suitable for traditional steppe warfare, they employed classic nomadic tactics of feigned retreat, encirclement, and sustained archery attacks that maximized their mobility advantages while minimizing exposure to enemy counterattacks. In mountainous regions, they modified these approaches to utilize terrain features for ambushes and defensive positions that negated enemy advantages in heavy infantry and siege equipment. In forested areas, they developed dismounted tactics that retained their essential mobility advantages while adapting to environmental constraints that limited traditional cavalry operations. This tactical flexibility enabled Cimmerian forces to operate effectively across environments ranging from Armenian highlands to Mediterranean coastal plains. Assyrian attempts to counter Cimmerian military advantages required fundamental modifications in imperial military organization and tactics that strained traditional command structures and training systems. Established reliance on heavy infantry formations and elaborate siege equipment proved inadequate against highly mobile opponents who refused to defend fixed positions or engage in conventional battlefield confrontations, where Assyrian numerical and technological advantages could prove decisive. Assyrian commanders began incorporating larger numbers of cavalry units into their forces and developing rapid response capabilities designed to intercept Cimmerian raiders before they could withdraw to inaccessible terrain. But these adaptations required substantial changes in military training, equipment procurement, and logistical support systems that challenged centuries of established military doctrine and organizational culture. The comprehensive documentation of Cimmerian military activities in Assyrian records reveals the broader transformative impact of nomadic warfare on established civilizations throughout the ancient world, demonstrating how mobile warrior cultures could challenge even the most sophisticated imperial systems. Unlike previous conflicts between the Assyrian Empire and neighboring kingdoms, which typically involved territorial conquest and subsequent administrative integration, Cimmerian raids represented a fundamentally different type of military challenge that couldn't be resolved through traditional diplomatic or military solutions. Their strategic objectives appeared focused on resource acquisition and political disruption rather than territorial control, creating ongoing security problems that persisted regardless of tactical victories or negotiated agreements. This represented a new form of warfare that challenged basic assumptions about how conflicts between settled and nomadic peoples should unfold, forcing imperial administrators to develop entirely new approaches to frontier management and military strategy. Assyrian provincial administration in regions affected by Cimmerian activities required fundamental reorganization to address persistent security threats that conventional administrative structures couldn't handle effectively. Traditional administrative centers located in fertile agricultural valleys for economic efficiency became vulnerable targets for nomadic raids, forcing the expensive construction of new fortified positions in defensible terrain that sacrificed economic optimization for military security. Tax collection systems required modification to account for periodic disruption of agricultural production and commercial activities caused by raid damage and population displacement, while military garrison requirements increased substantially throughout northern and western provinces where Cimmerian activity was most intense. These changes imposed significant additional costs on imperial administration while reducing the economic productivity that supported imperial expansion and maintenance. The technological exchange resulting from sustained Assyrian-Cimmerian military contact produced innovations that influenced warfare development throughout the ancient Near East, demonstrating how conflict between different military cultures could drive technological advancement. Assyrian smiths began incorporating design elements from captured Cimmerian weapons into their own military equipment, particularly improvements in sword construction and horse gear that enhanced performance in mobile warfare situations. Similarly, Cimmerian forces acquired Assyrian siege techniques and engineering knowledge that enhanced their ability to attack fortified positions, though they typically lacked the logistical capabilities necessary for sustained siege operations that characterized traditional Near Eastern warfare. This technological cross-pollination created hybrid military systems that combined nomadic mobility with sedentary engineering capabilities. The social and cultural impact of prolonged conflict with Cimmerian forces affected Assyrian society well beyond immediate military concerns, creating lasting changes in settlement patterns, architectural development, and economic planning throughout northern provinces. The constant threat of nomadic raids created an atmosphere of insecurity that influenced fundamental decisions about where to live, how to build, and how to organize economic activities in ways that prioritize security over efficiency or comfort. Archaeological evidence from Assyrian sites dating to this period shows increased emphasis on defensive construction and population concentration in more easily defended locations, reflecting the persistent challenge posed by highly mobile enemy forces that could strike anywhere without warning. The psychological impact of living under constant threat transformed civilian life in frontier regions and influenced imperial policy decisions for generations after active Cimmerian military pressure had subsided. The relentless pressure of Cimmerian military activities against Assyrian frontier territories created a devastating domino effect that ultimately reshaped the entire political landscape of Western Anatolia, demonstrating how nomadic warfare could destabilize regional power structures far beyond the immediate zones of military contact. As Assyrian forces concentrated their defensive efforts along eastern approaches to their core territories, the western regions of Anatolia found themselves increasingly exposed to nomadic incursions that their own military systems were completely unprepared to handle. The famous wooden furniture preserved within the Midas burial mound, including elaborately carved tables and ceremonial serving stands that once graced royal banquets, bears unmistakable axe marks and fire damage consistent with systematic destruction during savage urban warfare that left no corner of the city untouched. Pottery assemblages recovered from destruction contexts contained distinctly Cimmerian-type vessels alongside traditional Phrygian wares, revealing that the attackers occupied the city for sufficient duration to establish temporary administrative control and impose their own cultural practices on the conquered population. This evidence suggests the Cimmerian assault on Gordion wasn't simply a destructive raid, but a calculated conquest that involved extended occupation and systematic dismantling of Phrygian royal authority. The archaeological record paints a vivid picture of methodical destruction designed to eliminate any possibility of political recovery or resistance revival, demonstrating strategic thinking that went far beyond mere plunder and devastation. The death of King Midas during the Cimmerian assault on Gordion marked the catastrophic end of Phrygian political independence and the collapse of one of Anatolia's most prosperous kingdoms, while later sources, including Herodotus and various classical authors, preserve conflicting versions of Midas's final moments. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that he perished during the desperate defense of his capital rather than by suicide, as some romanticized literary sources subsequently claim to preserve royal dignity in defeat. The royal burial complex at Gordion displays unmistakable signs of hasty completion and dramatically abbreviated funeral rituals, entirely consistent with burial conducted during a period of acute military crisis and complete political collapse. The contrast between the planned magnificence of Midas's intended tomb and the desperate improvisation evident in its actual completion provides poignant testimony to the sudden transformation of Phrygian fortunes from unprecedented prosperity to utter catastrophe. The complete destruction of Phrygian royal authority created an enormous power vacuum in central Anatolia that neighbouring kingdoms immediately scrambled to exploit, triggering secondary conflicts that spread instability across the entire region. The Kingdom of Lydia, strategically positioned in the fertile Hermus River Valley, possessed both the geographic advantages and military capabilities necessary to expand eastward into former Phrygian territories that suddenly lacked effective defence or political organisation. However, Lydian expansion efforts immediately brought them into direct and devastating conflict with the same Cimmerian forces that had obliterated Phrygian power, creating a complex three-way struggle for control of western Anatolia's most fertile and strategically crucial regions. This confrontation would test whether any sedentary kingdom could develop effective countermeasures against the nomadic military revolution that had already destroyed the region's dominant power. Lydian military organisation differed fundamentally from both Phrygian and Cimmerian models, incorporating innovative adaptations that reflected their unique geographic position and exceptional economic resources derived from gold-rich river valleys. The kingdom's location in the precious metal deposits of western Anatolia provided access to wealth that enabled the development of professional military forces equipped with standardized weapons and armor, manufactured to specifications that exceeded anything previously seen in regional warfare. Lydian cavalry units employed specially bred warhorses, significantly larger and more heavily armoured than typical Cimmerian mounts, though necessarily sacrificing some mobility for greater shock impact in direct confrontation. These tactical choices reflected deliberate adaptation to counter Cimmerian advantages, emphasizing concentrated force over distributed flexibility in an attempt to create battlefield conditions where superior equipment and training could overcome nomadic tactical superiority. The initial encounters between Lydian and Cimmerian forces revealed both the strengths and critical limitations of each military system when confronted with fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Lydian heavy cavalry proved capable of inflicting devastating casualties on Cimmerian formations when tactical conditions favoured direct engagement, particularly in open terrain where their superior armour and weapons provided decisive advantages that nomadic forces couldn't counter through superior mobility alone. However, Cimmerian tactical flexibility and superior strategic mobility enabled them to dictate engagement conditions that minimized Lydian advantages, while ruthlessly exploiting weaknesses in their more rigid military organization. The nomadic ability to choose when, where, and how to fight proved decisive in determining campaign outcomes, regardless of individual battle results, that might favor Lydian tactical superiority under specific circumstances. Archaeological evidence from battle sites throughout the Hermus and Caicus river valleys documents the extraordinary intensity and extended duration of Lydian-Cimmerian conflicts during the late 7th century BCE, revealing warfare that exceeded anything previously witnessed in the region. Weapon fragments recovered from these locations include both distinctive Lydian iron spearheads and elaborately crafted swords alongside characteristic Cimmerian arrowheads and specialized horse gear, indicating sustained close-quarters combat rather than the hit-and-run tactics typically associated with nomadic warfare against less capable opponents. The presence of substantial quantities of military equipment scattered across extensive battlefield sites suggests major engagements involving thousands of warriors from both sides, representing a significant escalation from the smaller-scale raids that had characterized earlier Cimmerian activities against less formidable opposition. These discoveries indicate that Lydian military capabilities forced Cimmerian commanders to modify their traditional tactical approaches and accept higher casualties in exchange for territorial gains. The devastating economic impact of prolonged warfare on Lydian society created internal pressures that fundamentally influenced military and diplomatic strategies available to royal administrators. Unlike the Cimmerians, who could sustain themselves indefinitely through raiding activities and possessed minimal logistical requirements that allowed extended campaigning, Lydian military forces required extensive supply systems and substantial financial resources that could only be maintained through continued agricultural production and uninterrupted commercial activity. Extended campaigns against Cimmerian forces placed enormous strain on these economic foundations, forcing Lydian rulers to seek alternative approaches to managing the nomadic threat that went beyond purely military solutions. The kingdom's dependence on complex economic infrastructure made it vulnerable to disruption tactics that nomadic forces could employ without accepting decisive battle under conditions favourable to Lydian tactical strengths. Diplomatic negotiations between Lydian rulers and Cimmerian leaders represent one of the most fascinating and complex aspects of this crucial conflict period, demonstrating sophisticated political thinking on both sides despite their radically different cultural backgrounds. Cuneiform tablets recovered from Assyrian archives suggest that both parties recognize potential benefits of cooperation against common enemies, particularly the expanding Assyrian Empire and various ambitious Anatolian kingdoms seeking to exploit regional instability for their own territorial advantage. These diplomatic contacts required extraordinarily sophisticated translation capabilities and cultural mediation services, as the fundamental differences between nomadic and sedentary societies created communication barriers that extended far beyond simple language differences to encompass entirely different concepts of political authority, territorial control, and military objectives. The mere fact that such negotiations occurred indicates mutual recognition of each side's military capabilities and the potential advantages of alliance over continued conflict. The temporary alliance forged between certain Lydian and Cimmerian factions during 660 BCE demonstrates the remarkable pragmatic flexibility that characterized both cultures' approach to regional politics when strategic circumstances demanded cooperation over competition. Archaeological evidence from this period shows distinctive Cimmerian-type weapons and specialized horse gear appearing in Lydian elite burial contexts, suggesting either formal diplomatic gift exchange or the direct incorporation of Cimmerian military specialists into Lydian forces as advisors or mercenary units. Similarly, distinctively Lydian metalwork and luxury goods appear in archaeological contexts associated with Cimmerian activities, indicating reciprocal exchange relationships that went beyond mere diplomatic courtesy to encompass substantial material transfers. These discoveries suggest cultural interaction that transformed both societies despite their fundamental differences in lifestyle and political organization. The revolutionary military innovations that emerged from sustained Lydian-Cimmerian contact influenced warfare development throughout Western Anatolia and eventually across the entire ancient world, creating tactical syntheses that combined the best elements of both military traditions. Lydian adoption of improved archery techniques and refined cavalry tactics substantially enhanced their military effectiveness against traditional enemies while providing defensive capabilities against future nomadic incursions. Meanwhile, Cimmerian forces acquired advanced metalworking knowledge and sophisticated siege techniques that dramatically expanded their operational capabilities against fortified positions and urban centers. The synthesis of nomadic mobility with sedentary military technology created entirely new tactical possibilities that would influence military development from Greece to Persia and establish precedents for combined arms operations that remained relevant for centuries. The complex territorial arrangements that eventually stabilized Lydian-Cimmerian relations involved intricate compromises that carefully balanced the military and economic realities facing both sides, while acknowledging their mutual inability to achieve decisive victory through continued conflict. Lydian control over major urban centers and prime agricultural regions provided the economic foundation necessary for maintaining professional military forces and complex administrative systems. Simultaneously, Cimmerian groups retained secure access to essential pasture lands and crucial trade routes that supported their traditional pastoral lifestyle and enabled continued participation in the extensive commercial networks that connected Central Asia with Mediterranean markets. Archaeological evidence suggests that these arrangements involved formal territorial boundaries marked by strategically positioned fortified installations and mutual recognition of clearly defined spheres of influence. The gradual integration of Cimmerian military specialists into Lydian society created profound cultural changes that extended far beyond immediate military concerns to transform artistic traditions, religious practices, and social customs throughout the kingdom. Lydian artistic traditions began incorporating distinctive motifs and sophisticated techniques derived from steppe cultures, particularly evident in metalwork and textile production, that combined traditional Anatolian craftsmanship with nomadic aesthetic sensibilities. Burial practices at elite Lydian archaeological sites show unmistakable influences from nomadic traditions, including elaborate horse sacrifices and careful grave goods arrangements that reflect steppe cultural values and beliefs about proper preparation for the afterlife. These cultural exchanges demonstrate that sustained military contact between nomadic and sedentary societies could produce creative synthesis and mutual enrichment rather than simple domination by either side. The transformative impact of Cimmerian pressure on Lydian political development contributed directly to the centralization of royal authority and the creation of more efficient administrative systems capable of responding rapidly to military threats. The constant danger posed by nomadic forces required rapid decision-making capabilities and immediate resource mobilization that traditional aristocratic councils, with their lengthy, deliberative processes, simply could not provide effectively during crisis situations. Archaeological evidence indicates that Lydian royal palaces underwent extensive expansion and fortification during this period, reflecting both increased security concerns and the dramatic concentration of political power in royal institutions at the expense of traditional noble authority structures that had previously shared governance responsibilities with the monarchy. The extraordinary sophistication of burial goods recovered from elite Cimmerian graves indicates that their aristocratic leaders possessed both the substantial economic resources and extensive cultural connections necessary to acquire precious materials from Mediterranean workshops, Central Asian trading centres, and Caucasian metalworking traditions, demonstrating commercial networks that spanned 3 continents. These discoveries shatter simplistic assumptions about nomadic societies, revealing instead a culture capable of participating in the most exclusive luxury trade networks of the ancient world, while maintaining their distinctive identity and military effectiveness. Warrior status within Cimmerian society operated according to principles that differed fundamentally from the hereditary aristocracies typical of sedentary kingdoms, creating a dynamic social system where military prowess and successful leadership in raids or battles could elevate individuals regardless of their birth circumstances. Archaeological evidence suggests that aspiring warriors underwent rigorous formal initiation processes that included comprehensive tests of horsemanship, precision archery skills, and proven combat effectiveness against both human enemies and dangerous wild animals. Burial sites containing impressive weapon collections but relatively limited other grave goods likely represent warriors who achieved elevated status through personal achievement and demonstrated competence rather than inherited position or family wealth. This meritocratic element within Cimmerian military culture created opportunities for talented individuals to advance through proven capability, contributing to the overall effectiveness of their military system by ensuring leadership positions were filled by competent commanders rather than merely privileged nobles. The remarkable prevalence of weapon burials across all social levels within Cimmerian society indicates that military capability was considered absolutely essential for adult male identity, creating a warrior culture where every man was expected to possess both the equipment and skills necessary to defend his community and participate in offensive operations. This universal military preparedness provided Cimmerian society with unprecedented mobilization capabilities, allowing them to field large numbers of effective warriors when circumstances demanded major military campaigns. The central role of horse-centered pastoralism in Cimmerian society extended far beyond simple economic subsistence to encompass fundamental aspects of social identity, religious practice, and political organization that defined their entire cultural worldview. In their transformation from feared warriors to legendary figures, the Cimmerians exemplify the complex relationship between history and memory that characterizes human understanding of the past. They remind us that ancient peoples continue to speak to modern concerns through processes of cultural transmission that preserve some elements of historical reality while creating new meanings that serve contemporary purposes. Their story illustrates both the possibilities and limitations of historical reconstruction, while demonstrating the enduring power of human societies to create meaning from the fragmentary remains of their ancestors. The study of Cimmerian history ultimately reveals as much about our own approaches to understanding the past as it does about the ancient peoples themselves, highlighting the importance of critical methodology while acknowledging the cultural processes that shape historical memory and interpretation across generations. Horses represented not merely transportation animals or military assets, but powerful symbols of social status, spiritual power, and cultural continuity that connected Cimmerian communities to their ancestral traditions and distinguished them from sedentary peoples who lacked comparable expertise in equine management. Archaeological analysis of horse remains recovered from Cimmerian sites reveals sophisticated selective breeding programs that produced animals specifically optimized for distinct purposes including battlefield performance, extended long-distance travel, ceremonial display functions, and specialized dairy production that provided essential nutrition during harsh winter conditions. These breeding programs required generations of careful genetic selection and demonstrated scientific understanding of hereditary traits that rivals modern animal husbandry techniques. Cimmerian herding practices demanded extensive accumulated knowledge of seasonal grazing patterns, reliable water sources, and complex territorial boundaries that enabled sustainable exploitation of steppe environments across vast geographic ranges without depleting resources or creating conflicts with neighboring pastoral groups. The mobility demands imposed by pastoral nomadism created distinctive social structures, emphasizing portable wealth accumulation, flexible kinship networks, and rapid decision-making processes that could adapt quickly to changing environmental conditions or shifting political circumstances. Archaeological evidence strongly suggests that Cimmerian communities maintained remarkably detailed oral traditions that preserved crucial geographical knowledge, complex genealogical information, and essential cultural practices across multiple generations of migration and territorial displacement. These oral traditions served as living libraries that enabled communities to maintain cultural continuity even during periods of extreme disruption and geographic dispersion that might have destroyed less resilient social systems. The strategic integration of agricultural populations into Cimmerian society created complex symbiotic relationships between nomadic and sedentary economic systems that went far beyond simple conquest and exploitation. Rather than systematically destroying agricultural settlements that could provide valuable resources, successful Cimmerian groups often incorporated farming communities as dependent allies who provided essential grain supplies, manufactured goods, and specialized services in exchange for military protection and access to pastoral products like meat, dairy products, and leather goods. Archaeological evidence from numerous sites throughout the Caucasus region shows mixed material assemblages containing both distinctive nomadic artifacts and traditional agricultural implements, suggesting sustained peaceful interaction and cultural exchange rather than simple military conquest and demographic replacement. These relationships demonstrate Cimmerian adaptability and strategic thinking that enabled them to create stable territorial arrangements despite their fundamentally mobile lifestyle. Religious beliefs and spiritual practices among the Cimmerians represented a sophisticated synthesis combining traditional steppe spiritual traditions with innovative adaptations reflecting their extensive contact with diverse cultural groups encountered during their massive migrations across Eurasia. Archaeological evidence suggests that sky god worship formed the central organizing element of Cimmerian religious practice, with particular emphasis placed on powerful deities associated with warfare, horses, and dramatic atmospheric phenomena like thunderstorms and lightning. Ritual deposits discovered at Cimmerian archaeological sites often include carefully arranged collections of weapons, specialized horse gear, and precious metals buried in elevated locations that clearly suggest offerings made to celestial powers, believed to control military success and community welfare. The substantial value of these sacrificial deposits indicates that Cimmerian communities were willing to invest considerable wealth in maintaining proper relationships with supernatural forces. Ancestor veneration played a crucial role in maintaining Cimmerian cultural identity across the severe disruptions caused by forced migration and constant warfare that characterized their historical experience. Elaborate burial practices, including the construction of substantial kurgan mounds requiring enormous labor investments and the inclusion of complete horse sacrifices representing significant wealth, demonstrate sophisticated beliefs in continued spiritual existence and the ongoing influence of deceased leaders on living community welfare. The willingness to invest substantial material resources in funeral ceremonies indicates that proper treatment of the dead was considered absolutely essential for maintaining supernatural protection and ensuring cultural continuity across generations. These practices created permanent monuments that served as territorial markers and spiritual focal points for scattered communities maintaining connections to ancestral traditions. Shamanic traditions within Cimmerian society provided essential spiritual guidance, medical treatment, and crucial ritual mediation between human communities and supernatural forces that controlled natural phenomena and military outcomes. Archaeological evidence for shamanic practices includes specialized grave goods such as polished bronze mirrors, elaborate ritual vessels, and carefully crafted animal bone implements that appear in burials of individuals who likely served important religious functions within their communities. The presence of psychoactive plant substances in certain burial contexts suggests that altered consciousness states achieved through ritual consumption played important roles in Cimmerian religious practices, enabling spiritual practitioners to communicate with supernatural entities and receive guidance regarding community decisions. These shamanic traditions provided psychological support systems that helped communities cope with the stresses of nomadic life and military conflict. The distinctive material culture of Cimmerian society reflects both their practical nomadic lifestyle requirements and their sophisticated artistic traditions that created objects of remarkable beauty and technical excellence despite the constraints imposed by constant mobility. Metalwork represents the most distinctive and technically accomplished aspect of Cimmerian craftsmanship, with bronze and iron objects displaying intricate decorative motifs that skillfully combined geometric patterns with stylized animal representations that encoded cultural values and religious beliefs. The famous Kelem's mirror, decorated with elaborate animal combat scenes demonstrating extraordinary artistic sophistication, proves the high level of aesthetic achievement possible within nomadic societies, despite their limited access to permanent workshops and specialized manufacturing tools. This masterpiece demonstrates that mobility constraints need not prevent the creation of objects rivaling the finest productions of sedentary civilizations, with established craft traditions and institutional support systems. Cimmerian metalworking techniques incorporated technological innovations derived from contact with various sedentary cultures, while maintaining distinctive stylistic characteristics that immediately identify their ethnic origin and cultural affiliation. Iron weapons recovered from Cimmerian archaeological sites show sophisticated understanding of differential heat treatment processes, with hardened cutting edges skillfully welded to flexible cores that provided optimal performance characteristics for mounted combat situations requiring both cutting effectiveness and structural durability. Bronze ornaments and specialized horse gear display complex casting techniques and intricate surface decoration that required considerable technical skill and extensive artistic training transmitted through formal apprenticeship systems. The consistent quality of Cimmerian metalwork across widely separated geographic locations indicates standardized training methods and shared aesthetic standards that maintained cultural unity despite territorial dispersion. Horse equipment represented perhaps the most technically demanding and culturally significant category of Cimmerian material culture, combining practical functionality with symbolic meaning that reflected the central importance of horses in their society. Bronze and iron horse bits recovered from archaeological contexts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of equine anatomy and behavior, with carefully designed cheek pieces and precisely engineered mouthpieces that maximized rider control, while minimizing potential injury to valuable animals. Decorative elements incorporated into horse gear often featured religious symbolism and cultural motifs that reflected the profound spiritual significance of horses within Cimmerian worldview and their role as intermediaries between earthly and supernatural realms. The investment of artistic effort and precious materials in horse equipment demonstrates that these objects served ceremonial and social functions beyond mere practical utility. Weapons technology among the Cimmerians emphasized essential qualities of portability, durability, and maximum effectiveness in mounted combat situations that defined their military superiority over sedentary opponents. The characteristic Cimmerian sword, featuring its distinctive crossguard and carefully balanced pommel design, represented an optimal engineering solution, balancing cutting effectiveness with structural integrity that made it equally suitable for both mounted and dismounted combat scenarios. Archaeological analysis reveals that Cimmerian swords were manufactured using sophisticated metallurgical techniques that produced blades capable of maintaining razor-sharp edges through extended combat use while retaining sufficient flexibility to absorb impact stresses without catastrophic failure. This combination of hardness and resilience required advanced understanding of heat treatment and metal composition that places Cimmerian weaponsmiths among the most skilled craftsmen of the ancient world. Archery equipment held special significance within Cimmerian military culture, with composite bows representing both practical weapons and powerful symbols of warrior status that distinguished accomplished fighters from ordinary community members. The construction of effective composite bows required specialized knowledge of optimal materials, organic adhesives, and precise assembly techniques that was transmitted through formal apprenticeship systems, ensuring consistent quality and performance standards. Archaeological evidence suggests that bow-making represented a specialized craft practiced by particular individuals within Cimmerian communities, with finished weapons serving as valuable trade goods and prestigious diplomatic gifts that could cement political alliances and demonstrate cultural sophistication. The complexity of composite bow construction indicates that Cimmerian society supported craft specialists whose expertise was essential for maintaining military effectiveness. The exceptional technical quality of Cimmerian metalwork required decades of intensive training and access to specialized tools and rare materials that could only be maintained through sustained community support and sophisticated craft guild systems that preserved knowledge across generations. The creation of their masterwork weapons and ornaments demanded not merely individual skill, but entire networks of miners, smelters, smiths, and finishers working in coordinated production chains that rivals the industrial organization of major urban civilizations, despite their nomadic lifestyle constraints. The sophisticated material culture and complex social hierarchies that defined Cimmerian society found their most dynamic and influential expression in revolutionary military organization systems that fundamentally transformed warfare across the ancient world, creating tactical innovations that would influence military development from Mediterranean coastal regions to Central Asian steppe lands. The transformation of traditional Bronze Age combat methods through Cimmerian innovations created tactical approaches combining mobility, firepower, and psychological warfare that challenged every established assumption about how battles should be fought and won. Archaeological evidence recovered from weapon caches, extensively studied battlefield sites, and elite burial complexes reveals military systems of extraordinary complexity that far exceeded the simple raiding bands described in contemporary written sources, demonstrating organizational capabilities that enabled relatively small nomadic populations to challenge and often defeat the greatest empires and most sophisticated armies of their era through superior tactics, equipment, and leadership. The foundation of Cimmerian military effectiveness rested upon the revolutionary integration of mounted archery, with coordinated cavalry tactics that maximized the decisive advantages of superior mobility while systematically minimizing the inherent vulnerabilities typically associated with nomadic warfare against organized opposition. Traditional steppe combat had emphasized individual warrior prowess and small-scale tribal raids designed to acquire livestock and prestige rather than territorial conquest. But Cimmerian military evolution produced tactical formations capable of coordinated maneuvers involving hundreds of mounted warriors operating as unified combat units under centralized command structures. Archaeological analysis of arrowhead distributions at carefully excavated battle sites reveals firing patterns entirely consistent with organized volleys rather than random individual shooting, indicating disciplined training and sophisticated battlefield coordination that required command structures capable of transmitting complex orders across extended battle lines during the chaos and confusion of mounted combat. These tactical formations demanded months of training to achieve the precision necessary for effective battlefield performance. The composite bow represented the crucial technological cornerstone of Cimmerian military supremacy, incorporating advanced engineering principles that delivered unprecedented range and armor-penetrating power compared to earlier archery systems developed by sedentary civilizations. Construction techniques involved precisely laminated layers of horn, specially selected wood, and processed sinew, bonded with carefully prepared organic adhesives that created weapons capable of propelling arrows with sufficient kinetic force to penetrate bronze armor at distances exceeding 200 meters. Archaeological examination of bow fragments recovered from Cimmerian sites reveals standardized dimensions and construction methods that suggest centralized production facilities capable of equipping large military formations with uniform equipment specifications that ensured consistent performance across entire armies. The uniformity of design and construction quality indicates sophisticated quality control systems that maintained weapon effectiveness even during periods of rapid military expansion, when demand for equipment might have encouraged shortcuts in manufacturing processes. Cimmerian arrowhead technology demonstrated remarkable sophistication in both metallurgical techniques and tactical design optimization that created projectiles specifically engineered for maximum battlefield effectiveness. Three-bladed socketed points manufactured from high-carbon iron showed clear evidence of systematic heat treatment that produced hardened cutting edges while maintaining flexible tangs that prevented breakage upon impact with hard targets like armor or bone. The distinctive triangular cross-section of Cimmerian arrowheads created wounds that were extremely difficult to treat using available medical techniques and caused maximum tissue damage that often proved fatal, even when initial penetration wasn't immediately lethal. The socketed construction enabled rapid field replacement of damaged points during extended campaigns, allowing warriors to maintain their effectiveness even after intensive combat that might damage or dull their ammunition. Archaeological evidence suggests that individual warriors carried specialized arrow types optimized for different tactical situations encountered during diverse military operations, including armor-piercing bodkin points designed specifically for heavily protected opponents, and broad-headed hunting points optimized for unarmored targets, where maximum tissue damage was more important than armor penetration. This tactical flexibility allowed Cimmerian forces to adapt their firepower to specific battlefield conditions and enemy equipment. The development of specialized horse equipment represented another crucial innovation that enabled Cimmerian military advantages over contemporary cavalry forces that lacked comparable understanding of equine management and control systems. Bronze and iron horse bits recovered from archaeological contexts demonstrate sophisticated understanding of equine anatomy and behavior, with carefully engineered cheek pieces that provided maximum rider control while minimizing potential injury to valuable animals that represented enormous investments in time and resources. The distinctive Cimmerian bit design featured precisely jointed mouthpieces with mechanical leverage systems that amplified rider commands, enabling precise maneuvering during complex battlefield evolutions that required split-second timing and absolute coordination between horse and rider. These technological improvements allowed Cimmerian cavalry to execute tactical maneuvers that were simply impossible for opponents using inferior equipment and training methods. Saddle technology, though poorly preserved in the archaeological record due to the organic materials involved, appears to have incorporated padding systems and primitive stirrup mechanisms that provided stability for mounted archery while maintaining the flexibility necessary for rapid mounting and dismounting during fluid combat situations. These innovations allowed Cimmerian warriors to shoot accurately while riding at full gallop, creating mobile firing platforms that could deliver devastating attacks while remaining virtually immune to retaliation from slower-moving opponents. Cimmerian sword technology synthesized metallurgical innovations with tactical requirements specific to mounted combat situations that demanded weapons capable of both cutting and thrusting attacks. The characteristic Kinakis sword featured a straight double-edged blade approximately 60 centimeters in length, with a distinctive crossguard and pommel design that provided optimal balance for single-handed use from horseback while maintaining sufficient blade length for effective reach in close combat. Archaeological analysis reveals sophisticated construction techniques involving pattern-welded blades that combined hardened steel cutting edges with flexible iron cores, creating weapons that maintained razor-sharp edges through extended combat use, while possessing sufficient structural integrity to withstand the tremendous impact stresses generated during mounted warfare. The crossguard design prevented the wielder's hand from sliding onto the blade during aggressive thrusting attacks, while providing crucial protection against enemy weapons attempting to bind or trap the sword. The heavy pommel served multiple functions as a counterweight that enhanced blade control and maneuverability, while functioning as an effective striking weapon during close combat situations where sword techniques might prove inadequate. This multi-purpose design reflected the practical engineering approach that characterized all Cimmerian military equipment, emphasizing versatility and effectiveness over purely aesthetic considerations. Spear technology among the Cimmerians emphasized versatility and portability, specifically suited to the demanding requirements of mounted warfare across diverse terrain and tactical situations. Archaeological evidence reveals two distinct spear categories: longer weapons designed for mounted combat engagements, and shorter javelins optimized for throwing from horseback during fluid battlefield situations where rapid strikes and immediate withdrawal were essential for survival. The mounted combat spears featured iron points with reinforced sockets and carefully balanced wooden shafts that provided optimal reach while remaining manageable for single-handed use during complex cavalry maneuvers. Javelin points showed distinctive barbed designs that made removal from wounds extremely difficult and painful, maximizing the psychological impact of these weapons while creating tactical advantages through the disruption and demoralization they caused in enemy formations. Defensive equipment among Cimmerian warriors achieved an optimal balance between protection requirements and the critical mobility demands of nomadic warfare that prioritize speed and maneuverability over static defense. Scale armor constructed from bronze or iron plates sewn onto leather backing provided effective protection against arrows and slashing attacks, while maintaining sufficient flexibility for mounted combat and the rapid movements essential for Cimmerian tactical success. Archaeological evidence suggests that armor coverage varied significantly according to warrior status and specific tactical role within military formations, with elite warriors possessing more extensive protection including specialized arm guards, reinforced helmets, and even protective equipment for their horses. The distinctive Cimmerian helmet design featured conical bronze construction, with articulated cheek guards and neck protection, often decorated with intricate animal motifs that reflected both artistic traditions and religious beliefs about supernatural protection in battle. The tactical employment of these sophisticated weapon systems created military capabilities that fundamentally altered the balance of power across the ancient Near East and established new paradigms for battlefield effectiveness. Cimmerian military doctrine emphasized rapid concentration of forces at decisive points, utilizing superior strategic mobility to achieve local numerical superiority even when overall force ratios might favor their opponents through sheer numbers or territorial advantages. Archaeological evidence recovered from extensively studied battlefield sites reveals tactical patterns entirely consistent with coordinated attacks by multiple cavalry units operating in careful coordination, with arrowhead distributions indicating systematic suppression of enemy formations, followed by precisely timed close combat engagements using spears and swords. These complex tactical sequences required extensive training and sophisticated command structures capable of coordinating multiple moving units across chaotic battlefield conditions. The logistics of nomadic warfare required innovative solutions to supply and maintenance challenges that differed substantially from those facing sedentary armies, with established supply lines and permanent base facilities. Cimmerian military forces operated with minimal baggage trains, carrying essential equipment on specially trained pack animals, while utilizing captured resources and systematic local procurement to sustain extended campaigns across vast distances. Archaeological evidence suggests that weapon maintenance was conducted by specialized smiths who accompanied military expeditions with portable forges and comprehensive toolkits that enabled field repairs and equipment replacement under battlefield conditions. The standardization of weapon designs facilitated this maintenance system by ensuring that replacement parts could be manufactured using standardized specifications, regardless of location or immediate material availability. Seasonal campaign patterns among the Cimmerians reflected both environmental constraints and tactical opportunities that influenced strategic military planning and operational objectives throughout annual cycles. Spring campaigns typically focused on systematic raids against agricultural settlements during critical planting seasons when disruption of farming activities created maximum long-term economic damage with minimal immediate military resistance from populations focused on survival rather than defense. Summer operations emphasized longer-range expeditions against major urban centers and commercial routes, taking advantage of favorable weather conditions and abundant grazing opportunities for cavalry mounts that enabled extended operations far from traditional territorial bases. Autumn campaigns concentrated on resource acquisition through carefully planned raids against harvest activities and systematic tribute collection from subordinated populations who had learned that cooperation offered better survival prospects than resistance. Winter periods were generally devoted to essential equipment maintenance, intensive training activities for new recruits, and complex political negotiations within Cimmerian tribal confederations that determined leadership structures and strategic objectives for the following campaign season. These cyclical patterns created predictable rhythms that allowed for long-term strategic planning while maintaining the flexibility necessary to exploit unexpected opportunities or respond to emerging threats. Similarly, Greek military development during the Archaic period shows unmistakable evidence of systematic experimentation with cavalry formations and refined archery techniques that reflect growing awareness of nomadic tactical advantages and the urgent need to counter mobile warfare methods that traditional infantry-based armies struggled to address effectively. These innovations represented fundamental departures from established Greek military doctrine that had emphasized heavy infantry formations and close-quarters combat over the mobility and ranged firepower that characterized nomadic warfare systems. Persian military organization under the mighty Achaemenid Empire incorporated numerous strategic elements derived directly from earlier steppe warfare traditions, including the extensive deployment of mounted archers, the systematic integration of nomadic auxiliary forces, and tactical doctrines that emphasized mobility and battlefield flexibility over the rigid formation fighting that had previously dominated Near Eastern warfare. The famous Persian immortals, while remaining primarily infantry-based units, operated with sophisticated cavalry support that employed weapons and tactics clearly influenced by Cimmerian and other nomadic military traditions developed across centuries of steppe warfare evolution. Archaeological evidence recovered from Persian sites includes weapons and equipment that demonstrate direct continuities with earlier steppe designs, indicating sustained cultural transmission of military technologies across centuries of dramatic political change and territorial conquest. These discoveries reveal how successful military innovations could transcend cultural boundaries and persist through successive imperial transitions when their effectiveness proves superior to existing alternatives. The revolutionary technological innovations pioneered by Cimmerian military culture created lasting impacts on metallurgical development throughout Eurasia that influenced weapon production from the Atlantic coastlines to Pacific shores. The sophisticated ironworking techniques required for effective composite bow construction, pattern-welded sword blades, and specialized arrowheads spread through extensive trade networks and cultural contacts to transform metalworking traditions across diverse civilizations that had previously relied on inferior technological approaches. Archaeological analysis of iron artifacts from diverse cultural contexts reveals technical approaches and design elements that can be directly traced to innovations first developed within nomadic military cultures, demonstrating how warfare-driven technological advancement could reshape entire craft traditions. The superior metallurgical knowledge developed by Cimmerian smiths provided competitive advantages that encouraged adoption by sedentary craftsmen seeking to improve their own products and serve military customers demanding better equipment. The psychological warfare aspects of Cimmerian military operations created devastating effects that extended far beyond immediate tactical advantages gained through superior equipment and battlefield techniques. The fearsome reputation for military effectiveness and utter ruthlessness that Cimmerian forces developed through their successful campaigns against major civilizations created terror effects that often preceded their actual arrival in contested territories, causing enemy demoralization and civilian panic that simplified subsequent military operations. Contemporary sources describe massive population movements and severe economic disruption triggered merely by rumors of approaching Cimmerian forces, indicating that their military reputation had become a strategic weapon capable of achieving political objectives without requiring actual combat engagements. This psychological dominance represented a force multiplier that enabled relatively small nomadic armies to achieve strategic impacts far exceeding their numerical strength or territorial control capabilities. Intelligence gathering and reconnaissance capabilities among Cimmerian forces enabled crucial tactical advantages that effectively compensated for their numerical disadvantages relative to the major empires and established armies they confronted across diverse theatres of operation. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cimmerian military leaders maintained extensive networks of informants and professional scouts who provided advanced warning of enemy movements alongside detailed intelligence regarding terrain features, resource locations, and political developments that could influence campaign planning. This sophisticated intelligence capability enabled Cimmerian forces to achieve strategic surprise and concentrate their attacks against vulnerable targets, while systematically avoiding unfavourable tactical situations, where enemy advantages in numbers or defensive positions might negate nomadic mobility and firepower advantages. The ability to gather and process actionable intelligence represented a crucial organizational capability that distinguished successful nomadic confederations from simple raiding bands lacking strategic vision or operational coordination. The remarkable adaptation of Cimmerian military techniques to diverse geographic environments demonstrated exceptional tactical flexibility and cultural learning capacity that enabled effective operations across territories ranging from Mediterranean coastlines to Central Asian deserts. Archaeological evidence from their extensive campaigns in Anatolia reveals systematic modifications to traditional steppe warfare methods that incorporated lessons learned from fighting in mountainous terrain, dense forests, and complex urban environments that presented challenges unknown in their original grassland homeland. These tactical adaptations included the development of specialized dismounted combat techniques for terrain unsuitable for cavalry operations, innovative siege warfare capabilities for attacking fortified positions, and sophisticated alliance strategies that enabled effective cooperation with local populations sharing common enemies or political objectives. This adaptability demonstrated that nomadic military culture could evolve rapidly to meet new challenges, while maintaining core advantages in mobility and flexibility that provided persistent competitive advantages. The sophisticated military machine that had systematically devastated Phrygian civilization and successfully challenged Lydian power inevitably encountered the expanding network of Greek colonial settlements established along the strategically important Black Sea coastline. These encounters between Cimmerian warbands and Greek colonists created complex dynamics that would profoundly influence both nomadic military tactics and Hellenic expansion strategies throughout the turbulent 7th century BCE, establishing patterns of interaction that shaped regional politics for centuries. Archaeological evidence from colonial sites reveals distinctive patterns of destruction, hasty abandonment, and desperate defensive adaptations that document the immediate and devastating impact of Cimmerian pressure on Greek settlement activities along the Pontic coastline. Literary sources preserved in later historical accounts maintain memories of violent conflicts that fundamentally shaped Greek perceptions of northern barbarians and influenced colonial policies for generations of subsequent expansion efforts. Greek colonization of the Black Sea region had commenced during the 8th century BCE, as mounting population pressures and attractive economic opportunities drove ambitious settlers from established mainland Greek cities to establish new communities along the fertile and strategically located Pontic coastline. These early colonial ventures, including settlements at Sinope, Trapezus, and Tanais, represented crucial strategic footholds that provided access to essential grain supplies, valuable raw materials, and lucrative trade routes connecting the sophisticated Mediterranean world with the vast untapped resources of the Eurasian steppes. The colonial settlements typically occupied carefully selected defensible coastal positions, featuring natural harbours that facilitated reliable maritime communications with mother cities, while providing some measure of protection against potential land-based attacks from inland populations who might view Greek expansion as threatening to their traditional territorial claims or economic interests. These defensive considerations reflected Greek awareness that colonial expansion involved inherent risks requiring careful planning and substantial defensive preparations. The initial encounters between Cimmerian forces and vulnerable Greek colonial settlements occurred during the late 8th century BCE as mounting nomadic pressure from Scythian expansion forced various Cimmerian groups to seek new territories and alternative resource bases beyond their traditional steppe homeland that had become increasingly contested and dangerous. Archaeological excavations at Sinop reveal extensive destruction layers dating to approximately 720 BCE, containing arrowheads of distinctly Cimmerian manufacture, alongside burned storage facilities and shattered defensive structures. The systematic and thorough nature of this destruction suggests carefully planned coordinated attacks rather than opportunistic raids conducted by undisciplined warbands, indicating that Cimmerian military leaders possessed sufficient strategic intelligence to recognize the economic value and political significance of Greek colonial positions. These attacks demonstrated nomadic capability for complex military planning and coordinated execution that exceeded Greek expectations based on their previous encounters with less organized tribal groups. The devastating impact of sustained Cimmerian raids on Greek colonial development extended far beyond immediate physical destruction to fundamentally influence settlement planning, defensive architecture, and colonial administration policies that prioritize security over economic optimization. Excavations at Chersonesos demonstrate significant modifications to urban layout during the early 7th century BCE, with the construction of massive stone fortifications that incorporated defensive innovations derived from careful study of Cimmerian siege techniques and assault methods. These impressive defensive works featured multiple concentric wall systems, heavily protected gates with complex approach routes designed to channel attackers into kill zones, and elevated archer positions that reflected detailed understanding of nomadic assault tactics and the need to counter superior mobility with concentrated defensive firepower. The enormous investment required for such extensive fortifications indicates that Greek colonists considered Cimmerian military pressure a persistent and existential threat, requiring maximum defensive preparation regardless of economic costs. Cimmerian military tactics proved devastatingly effective against Greek colonial settlements due to inherent vulnerabilities of isolated communities that depended on vulnerable maritime supply lines and local agricultural production conducted in hostile territory where friendly support was limited or non-existent. The decisive mobility advantages that characterized nomadic warfare enabled Cimmerian forces to strike coastal settlements during critical periods when relief expeditions from distant mainland Greek cities could not arrive quickly enough to provide effective military assistance. Archaeological evidence from permanently abandoned colonial sites shows clear patterns of hasty evacuation, with valuable goods buried in hidden caches that were never recovered by their owners, suggesting that many settlements were abandoned permanently after devastating Cimmerian attacks that made continued occupation untenable. These discoveries provide stark testimony to the effectiveness of nomadic military pressure in forcing strategic withdrawal by technologically advanced but numerically inferior colonial populations. The severe economic disruption caused by persistent Cimmerian pressure fundamentally altered Greek colonial strategies throughout the Black Sea region, forcing abandonment of traditional expansion models that had emphasized agricultural development and systematic local resource exploitation. The constant threat of unpredictable nomadic raids forced Greek settlers to concentrate defensive efforts on more secure coastal positions, while systematically abandoning inland settlements that had provided access to fertile agricultural zones, essential for colonial economic viability. Archaeological surveys conducted in the hinterlands of major colonial sites reveal numerous abandoned farmsteads and rural settlements dating to this period, indicating systematic withdrawal from exposed positions to more defensible coastal enclaves that sacrificed economic opportunities for enhanced security. This strategic retreat represented a fundamental acknowledgement that nomadic military capabilities could not be countered through traditional defensive measures alone. The dramatic siege of Sardis in 652 BCE represents the most significant and well-documented direct confrontation between Cimmerian forces and Greek military units, as Lydian king Gyges had recruited substantial numbers of experienced Greek mercenaries to strengthen his defensive capabilities against mounting nomadic pressure that threatened to destroy his kingdom. Contemporary sources, including fragmentary accounts preserved by later historians, describe a complex siege operation that lasted several months and involved sophisticated coordination between Cimmerian cavalry units and allied forces recruited from various Anatolian populations united in opposition to Lydian territorial expansion. The presence of professional Greek mercenaries in Lydian service created unique tactical challenges for Cimmerian commanders who suddenly faced opponents familiar with both traditional Greek hoplite warfare techniques and the nomadic tactics they had observed during previous colonial conflicts along the Black Sea coastline. This combination of military experience forced Cimmerian forces to modify their standard tactical approaches and develop new methods for countering opponents who understood their capabilities and limitations. Archaeological evidence recovered from extensive excavations at the Sardis siege site reveals the extraordinary intensity and technical sophistication of Cimmerian assault methods when systematically applied to major urban centres with sophisticated defensive preparations. Excavations in the lower city area have uncovered extensive destruction layers containing thousands of arrowheads, clear evidence of systematic fire damage designed to eliminate defensive structures, and the remains of siege equipment including scaling ladders and protective mantlets, constructed from locally acquired materials. The precise distribution pattern of military artifacts suggests that Cimmerian forces employed carefully coordinated simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, utilizing their superior mobility to prevent effective concentration of defensive forces at specific threatened points while maintaining pressure across the entire defensive perimeter. This tactical sophistication demonstrates advanced military planning capabilities that exceeded contemporary assumptions about nomadic organizational abilities. The catastrophic demise of King Gyges during the climactic assault on Sardis represented a decisive turning point in Lydian-Cimmerian relations, while simultaneously providing Greek military observers with unprecedented detailed intelligence regarding nomadic siege warfare techniques that would transform Mediterranean military thinking. Contemporary battlefield reports describe methodical breaches of the city's formidable defensive walls through precisely coordinated attacks that masterfully combined suppressive archery barrages with direct assault operations conducted by dismounted warriors equipped with specialized scaling equipment and improvised siege tools crafted from local materials. The triumphant capture of such a massively fortified urban centre demonstrated conclusively that Cimmerian military capabilities had evolved far beyond simple hit-and-run raiding tactics to encompass sophisticated siege warfare techniques, systematically adapted from extensive contact with various sedentary civilizations encountered during their westward expansion. This tactical evolution represented a fundamental transformation in nomadic warfare capabilities that challenged every established assumption about the limitations of pastoral military systems. Greek literary sources from the classical period preserve remarkably complex and frequently contradictory portrayals of Cimmerian peoples that reflect both authentic historical memories of actual military conflicts and elaborate mythological embellishments developed over centuries of oral transmission and artistic elaboration. Herodotus provides the most comprehensive and systematic historical account of Cimmerian activities available to modern scholarship, though his extensive narrative combines reliable information derived from Persian and Scythian sources with legendary materials that served literary and entertainment purposes rather than historical documentation. His detailed description of Cimmerian origins and migration patterns corresponds remarkably well to archaeological evidence recovered from excavations across the North Pontic steppes, but his dramatic accounts of specific battles and complex political arrangements require extremely careful scholarly analysis to separate factual historical content from narrative embellishment, designed to enhance reader engagement and reinforce moral themes. The persistent scholarly challenge of distinguishing between historical and mythological Cimmerians in Greek literature presents ongoing interpretive difficulties, as later classical authors frequently conflated actual nomadic peoples with legendary figures derived from earlier poetic traditions that prioritized artistic impact over historical accuracy. Homer's references to Cimmerians in the Odyssey clearly describe mythical peoples dwelling at the shadowy edges of the known world, rather than historical populations with documented territorial claims and political institutions. Nevertheless, these influential poetic descriptions profoundly shaped later Greek perceptions of northern barbarians and contributed to enduring literary traditions that systematically obscured factual knowledge about actual Cimmerian society, culture, and political organization. Archaeological evidence provides the most reliable and objective foundation for understanding historical Cimmerian activities and cultural characteristics. Though literary sources remain invaluable for documenting contemporary Greek responses to nomadic military pressure and its lasting impact on Hellenic civilization, the transformative influence of sustained Cimmerian military pressure on Greek colonial expansion strategies created permanent changes in Hellenic settlement patterns throughout the Black Sea region, and beyond that, persisted long after the immediate nomadic threat had subsided. The demonstrated vulnerability of isolated colonial positions to coordinated nomadic attacks encouraged Greek mother cities to establish larger, more heavily fortified settlements capable of withstanding extended sieges, rather than establishing dispersed networks of smaller agricultural communities that maximized economic exploitation but offered minimal defensive capabilities. Archaeological evidence recovered from later colonial sites shows systematic incorporation of sophisticated defensive features designed specifically to counter nomadic assault methods that had proven so devastatingly effective against earlier settlements, including elevated citadels positioned on naturally defensive terrain, multiple concentric defensive perimeters that channeled attackers into predetermined kill zones, and carefully protected water sources that could sustain substantial populations during prolonged blockades. The dramatic acceleration of westward Greek colonization during the 7th century BCE reflects direct strategic responses to mounting Cimmerian pressure in traditional eastern expansion areas that had previously offered attractive opportunities for territorial acquisition and commercial development. As Black Sea colonial ventures became increasingly dangerous and economically unviable due to persistent nomadic military activities that disrupted trade routes and agricultural production, Greek cities systematically redirected their expansion efforts towards Sicily, southern Italy, and the western Mediterranean regions where indigenous populations posed less sophisticated military challenges. Archaeological evidence from Western colonial sites dating to this crucial period shows rapid expansion of Greek settlement activities that corresponds precisely chronologically with the peak period of Cimmerian pressure in Anatolia and the Black Sea region, demonstrating clear causal relationships between nomadic military activities and Hellenic expansion patterns. This geographical reorientation of Greek colonization had lasting consequences for Mediterranean political development and cultural exchange patterns. The extensive technological exchange resulting from sustained Greek-Cimmerian military contact produced significant innovations that influenced warfare development throughout the Mediterranean world and established precedents for military technology transfer that would characterize ancient warfare for centuries. Greek military equipment from the 7th century BCE shows unmistakable influences from nomadic weapons technology, particularly evident in refined arrowhead designs, improved cavalry equipment, and innovative siege warfare techniques that incorporated lessons learned from nomadic assault methods. Conversely, Cimmerian forces systematically acquired knowledge of Greek metallurgical methods, advanced fortification design principles, and naval warfare capabilities that substantially enhanced their operational effectiveness against other sedentary civilizations encountered during their continuing expansion campaigns. Archaeological evidence recovered from both Greek and nomadic sites documents this crucial technological transfer through the appearance of hybrid weapon designs and modified tactical equipment that combined the best elements of both military traditions. The complex diplomatic relationships that occasionally developed between certain Greek cities and Cimmerian leaders during periodic intervals of reduced military tension reveal the remarkable pragmatic flexibility that characterized both cultures' approaches to international relations when mutual interests aligned despite fundamental cultural differences. Inscriptional evidence from later historical periods preserves fragmentary references to formal treaties and commercial agreements between Greek colonies and nomadic peoples, though the specific identification of these groups as Cimmerians remains problematic due to the generic terminology typically employed in Greek diplomatic correspondence. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Greek colonial sites maintained profitable trade relationships with nomadic populations even during periods of active military conflict, indicating extraordinarily complex political arrangements that transcended simple binary hostility and demonstrated sophisticated understanding of economic opportunities that could benefit both parties despite ongoing territorial disputes. The profound impact of sustained Cimmerian pressure on Greek military development contributed directly to tactical innovations that would influence Hellenic warfare for centuries and establish foundational principles for combined arms operations that became standard practice throughout the Mediterranean world. The demonstrated effectiveness of mounted archery tactics against traditional hoplite formations encouraged systematic experimentation with cavalry units and light infantry forces specifically trained and equipped to operate effectively against highly mobile opponents. Archaeological evidence from Greek sites dating to the late 7th century BCE includes specialized weapons and equipment designed specifically for cavalry warfare, representing significant departures from the traditional heavy infantry emphasis that had characterized earlier Greek military culture and dominated battlefield tactics since the emergence of the police system. These innovations reflected fundamental recognition that nomadic military capabilities required entirely new tactical approaches. The severe economic consequences of systematically disrupted Black Sea trade due to persistent Cimmerian activities forced Greek cities to develop alternative commercial networks and innovative resource acquisition strategies that reduced their dependence on traditional eastern trade routes. The devastating interruption of crucial grain supplies from Pontic agricultural regions created food security challenges that encouraged agricultural intensification in mainland Greek territories and the systematic development of alternative supply sources in Egypt and the Western Mediterranean. Archaeological evidence from Greek storage facilities and harbour installations shows significant modifications designed to accommodate fundamentally changing trade patterns and supply requirements during this period of severe commercial disruption that threatened the economic foundations of many Greek cities. These adaptations demonstrated remarkable economic resilience and strategic planning capabilities that enabled Greek civilization to survive and ultimately prosper despite nomadic military pressure. The powerful influence of Cimmerian military reputation on Greek political development contributed significantly to the emergence of tyrannical regimes in several major cities during the turbulent 7th century BCE. As external military pressure created political conditions that favoured strong individual leadership, capable of organising effective defensive measures and coordinating rapid military responses to unpredictable nomadic threats that could emerge suddenly from multiple directions. Archaeological evidence suggests that several Greek tyrants invested enormous resources in comprehensive fortification projects and advanced military equipment that reflected detailed awareness of nomadic warfare capabilities and the urgent need for enhanced defensive preparations that could counter superior mobility and tactical flexibility through superior defensive technology and coordination. The extensive cultural exchange between Greek colonists and Cimmerian populations produced remarkable artistic and technological innovations that spread rapidly throughout the ancient world and influenced cultural development patterns across multiple civilizations. Greek artistic traditions began systematically incorporating distinctive motifs and sophisticated techniques derived from steppe cultures, particularly evident in metalwork and decorative arts that combined traditional Hellenic aesthetic principles with nomadic design elements. Archaeological evidence from Greek colonial sites includes numerous artifacts that demonstrate creative fusion of Hellenic artistic traditions with nomadic design elements, creating distinctive hybrid styles that influenced artistic development throughout the Mediterranean region and established precedents for cross-cultural artistic exchange. Similarly, Cimmerian metalwork from this period shows clear influences from Greek technical methods and decorative traditions, indicating sustained cultural contact and mutual learning despite ongoing military conflicts. The relentless cycle of warfare that had sustained Cimmerian military dominance across Anatolia and the Near East for nearly a century began exacting an increasingly devastating toll on the fundamental social fabric and demographic foundations of nomadic society itself, creating internal contradictions that gradually undermined the political cohesion and strategic coordination necessary for maintaining effective resistance against increasingly sophisticated enemy responses that adapted to nomadic tactics. Archaeological evidence from the late 7th century BCE reveals unmistakable indicators of progressive social fragmentation, including the proliferation of smaller, less elaborate burial complexes that suggest declining community resources, reduced standardization in weapons production that indicates breakdown of centralized manufacturing systems, and the systematic abandonment of traditional territorial markers that had previously defined established Cimmerian tribal boundaries and maintained social organization. The continuous warfare that had initially enabled dramatic Cimmerian expansion and successful resource acquisition began producing severe demographic pressures that threatened the long-term viability of traditional nomadic society and forced fundamental changes in social organization that undermined military effectiveness. Military campaigns against major urban centers required substantial manpower commitments that systematically drew experienced warriors away from essential pastoral activities, severely disrupting seasonal migration patterns and reducing the labor force available for crucial animal husbandry activities. Archaeological analysis of animal bone assemblages from Cimmerian sites dating to this critical period shows clear evidence of declining herd sizes and reduced breeding success rates, indicating that military priorities were systematically compromising the economic foundations of traditional nomadic life and creating unsustainable resource pressures that threaten community survival. Assyrian military transformation during the mid-7th century BCE incorporated crucial strategic lessons learned from prolonged combat against nomadic opponents, including the systematic development of specialized cavalry units trained specifically for counter-mobility operations, significantly improved archery equipment manufactured to match steppe weapon standards, and comprehensive tactical doctrines designed specifically to neutralize mobile warfare methods that had previously devastated traditional Near Eastern armies through superior speed and flexibility. The gradual emergence of effective counter-strategies among sedentary civilizations represented perhaps the most existential challenge to continued Cimmerian military dominance across the ancient world, fundamentally altering the strategic balance that had favored nomadic forces for nearly a century. The initial psychological shock effect that had enabled relatively small nomadic forces to overwhelm much larger and better equipped armies began diminishing significantly as enemy commanders systematically developed tactical approaches specifically designed to neutralize traditional nomadic advantages through superior preparation and coordination. Archaeological evidence recovered from extensively studied battlefield sites dating to the late 7th century BCE reveals increasing quantities of specialized anti-cavalry weapons, including exceptionally long spears specifically designed for tight infantry formations, and carefully manufactured caltrops intended to disable enemy horses during rapid maneuvers. These military innovations indicated systematic adaptation based on careful study of nomadic tactics, rather than desperate ad hoc responses to immediate pressure. The dramatic ascension of Aliats to the Lydian throne around 610 BCE marked the beginning of sustained and increasingly successful resistance to Cimmerian military pressure throughout western Anatolia, representing a fundamental shift in regional power dynamics. Unlike his predecessors, who had relied primarily on passive defensive strategies and uncertain diplomatic arrangements, Aliates implemented aggressive counter-campaign policies designed to systematically eliminate Cimmerian strongholds and comprehensively disrupt their operational bases through persistent offensive operations. Archaeological evidence from his transformative reign includes extensive fortification projects that incorporated advanced engineering techniques developed through careful study of siege warfare, and the strategic establishment of forward operating bases in previously contested territories that had been dominated by nomadic forces. Aliates' revolutionary military innovations reflected sophisticated understanding of nomadic warfare methods combined with systematic exploitation of their inherent structural vulnerabilities. Rather than attempting to match Cimmerian mobility through expensive cavalry development programs that would have required generations to perfect, Lydian forces under his brilliant command concentrated on systematically controlling strategic resources and crucial geographical choke points that nomadic operations absolutely required for sustained military effectiveness. Archaeological excavations at sites positioned along major river crossings and mountain passes reveal carefully planned fortified positions dating to this period, equipped with substantial garrisons and comprehensive supply depots capable of supporting extended operations against highly mobile opponents. The methodical nature of Aliats' counter-campaigns involved precisely coordinated attacks against Cimmerian seasonal camps, essential grazing areas, and vulnerable supply bases that targeted the fundamental logistical foundations of nomadic military operations rather than seeking decisive battlefield confrontations where nomadic tactical advantages might prove overwhelming. Intelligence networks systematically developed by Lydian forces provided detailed information about Cimmerian movement patterns and critical resource requirements, enabling preemptive strikes against vulnerable targets. Archaeological evidence from abandoned Cimmerian campsites shows unmistakable evidence of systematic destruction, including thoroughly burned storage facilities, scattered military equipment, and hastily buried valuable possessions that were never recovered by their owners, indicating successful disruption of nomadic operational cycles that forced fundamental changes in their strategic approach. The remarkable effectiveness of Lydian counter-operations stemmed partly from Aliates' diplomatic ability to coordinate his military activities with other regional powers facing similar nomadic pressures, creating unprecedented cooperation among traditionally competing kingdoms. Diplomatic correspondence preserved in Assyrian archives suggests formal alliance arrangements between Lydia and various Anatolian kingdoms that enable coordinated military campaigns and shared intelligence regarding Cimmerian activities across multiple theatres of operation. These sophisticated cooperative relationships created serious strategic challenges for Cimmerian forces, who suddenly found themselves facing simultaneous military pressure from multiple directions, while their traditional tactics of exploiting political divisions among sedentary populations became increasingly ineffective against coordinated opposition that shared information and strategic objectives. The crucial technological advantages that had previously favoured Cimmerian military operations began steadily eroding as sedentary civilizations systematically developed effective countermeasures and acquired similar capabilities through various forms of military exchange, technological transfer, and captured equipment analysis. Lydian forces under Aliats demonstrated remarkable proficiency with composite bows, mounted archery techniques, and cavalry tactics that had formerly been exclusive to nomadic peoples. Archaeological evidence from Lydian military sites includes weapons and specialized equipment that show unmistakable influences from steppe traditions, indicating systematic adoption of nomadic military technologies by their sedentary opponents who proved capable of adapting superior techniques while maintaining their own tactical innovations and organizational advantages. The gradual but inexorable shift from offensive to defensive operations forced fundamental changes in Cimmerian military organization and tactical approaches that compromised their traditional advantages. The mobile warfare methods that had enabled spectacular successes against unprepared enemies proved significantly less effective when facing opponents who had systematically adapted their strategies specifically to counter nomadic advantages through careful preparation and strategic coordination. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cimmerian forces began constructing more permanent fortified positions during this critical period, representing significant departures from traditional nomadic practices that emphasized mobility over territorial control and had provided their primary strategic advantages for centuries. The establishment of permanent or semi-permanent bases created entirely new vulnerabilities that Lydian and other enemy forces systematically exploited through concentrated siege operations. Fixed positions required substantial garrison forces that significantly reduced the manpower available for mobile operations that had been the foundation of Cimmerian military effectiveness, while the urgent need to defend specific locations severely limited tactical flexibility and enabled enemy forces to concentrate their attacks against known targets that couldn't be abandoned without losing face and strategic position. Archaeological excavations at former Cimmerian strongholds reveal compelling evidence of systematic siege operations, including carefully constructed approach trenches, specialized artillery positions, and clear evidence of sustained bombardment using advanced siege equipment that indicates sophisticated siege warfare capabilities among their opponents that matched or exceeded nomadic defensive preparations. The complex assimilation processes that began affecting Cimmerian populations during the late 7th century BCE reflected both mounting military pressures and attractive economic opportunities that increasingly encouraged integration with sedentary societies, rather than continued resistance that offered diminishing prospects for success. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout Anatolia and the Caucasus region shows gradual transitions from nomadic to sedentary material culture patterns, with traditional Cimmerian artifacts appearing alongside locally produced pottery, agricultural tools, and architectural remains indicating permanent settlement. These dramatic changes suggest that substantial numbers of Cimmerian people systematically abandoned traditional pastoral lifestyles in favor of agricultural or urban occupations that offered greater security and economic stability than continued nomadic existence under constant military pressure from increasingly effective enemies. The adoption of sedentary lifestyles created fundamental changes in social organization, economic activities, and cultural practices that gradually eroded traditional Cimmerian identity markers that had maintained ethnic cohesion for centuries. Archaeological analysis of settlement sites shows clear evidence of agricultural activities, specialized craft production, and architectural developments that required long-term territorial commitment incompatible with nomadic mobility that had defined Cimmerian culture. Pottery assemblages from these transitional sites display distinctive hybrid characteristics, combining traditional Cimmerian decorative motifs with local technical traditions, indicating cultural synthesis rather than simple conquest or demographic displacement by hostile populations. Marriage relationships between Cimmerian individuals and members of established sedentary populations facilitated cultural integration processes that accelerated the dissolution of distinct ethnic boundaries through intermarriage and shared economic activities. Archaeological evidence from burial sites shows increasing numbers of graves containing mixed material culture assemblages that combine nomadic and sedentary traditions, suggesting extensive intermarriage and cultural exchange at the family level that created new social identities. These relationships created complex kinship networks that transcended traditional ethnic divisions and provided practical pathways for individual and group assimilation into local populations. The compelling economic incentives for abandoning traditional nomadic lifestyles became increasingly attractive as military opportunities diminished and sedentary occupations offered greater security and prosperity than continued resistance that faced mounting opposition from increasingly effective enemies. Archaeological evidence suggests that former Cimmerian warriors found lucrative employment as mercenaries in various regional armies, while others successfully established themselves as skilled craftsmen, experienced traders, or productive agricultural workers in established communities. The specialized skills developed through nomadic life, including superior horsemanship, advanced metalworking techniques, and extensive military expertise, provided valuable qualifications for successful integration into sedentary economic systems that appreciated their unique capabilities and were willing to provide opportunities for advancement. The accelerating fragmentation of Cimmerian political authority facilitated assimilation processes by systematically eliminating the institutional mechanisms that had previously maintained ethnic cohesion and cultural continuity across scattered tribal groups. Without unified leadership capable of coordinating effective resistance to external pressures or maintaining traditional practices that defined group identity, individual Cimmerian communities faced stark choices between continued resistance with diminishing prospects for success or integration with more powerful neighbors offering security and economic opportunities. Archaeological evidence suggests that most communities chose integration over resistance, though the process occurred gradually over several generations rather than through sudden abandonment of traditional practices that would have created cultural trauma and social disruption. The linguistic assimilation of Cimmerian populations into local communities represents one of the most significant but poorly documented aspects of this integration process that fundamentally altered regional cultural development. While archaeological evidence can effectively document changes in material culture and settlement patterns, the gradual adoption of local languages and the systematic abandonment of traditional Cimmerian linguistic practices remains largely invisible in the archaeological record. However, the survival of certain place names and personal names in later historical periods suggests that linguistic assimilation was incomplete, and that some Cimmerian linguistic elements persisted within local populations, contributing to regional dialectical development and cultural diversity. The religious and cultural practices that had maintained Cimmerian identity faced particular challenges during the assimilation process, as traditional nomadic spiritual traditions required specific environmental contexts and social structures that were fundamentally incompatible with sedentary lifestyles and urban living conditions. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites shows gradual abandonment of traditional burial practices, including the construction of kurgan mounds and elaborate horse sacrifices, and in favour of local funeral customs that reflected integration into established communities. However, some elements of traditional religious practice appear to have survived through syncretic combinations with local spiritual traditions, creating hybrid belief systems that preserved certain Cimmerian cultural elements within new social contexts. The final dispersal of identifiable Cimmerian populations occurred through complex processes that varied significantly across different geographical regions and political contexts, reflecting the diverse circumstances that different groups encountered during their integration into sedentary societies. In some areas, decisive military defeat and complete political collapse led to rapid scattering of surviving populations who fled to distant territories, while in others, gradual economic and social integration enabled more systematic absorption into local communities through intermarriage and cultural adaptation. Archaeological evidence suggests that the latest clearly identifiable Cimmerian material culture assemblages date to approximately 620 BCE, though isolated groups may have maintained traditional practices for several additional decades in remote areas where external pressure was less intense and traditional lifestyles remained viable. The absorption of remaining Cimmerian populations into various regional ethnic groups created lasting influences on the cultural development of Anatolian and Caucasian societies that persisted long after their distinct identity disappeared. Archaeological evidence from the 6th century BCE shows continued presence of artistic motifs, metallurgical techniques, and military equipment designs that derived from Cimmerian traditions, indicating that cultural assimilation preserved certain elements of nomadic heritage within sedentary contexts that valued their technical expertise and aesthetic contributions. certain regions display compelling evidence of fresh settlement establishment that corresponds precisely chronologically with documented Cimmerian presence in historical sources, while other areas demonstrate continuity in existing settlement patterns, accompanied by gradual material culture changes, indicating profound cultural influence rather than wholesale demographic replacement through conquest or forced migration. This archaeological pattern suggests that Cimmerian impact on regional development operated through multiple mechanisms, including direct settlement, cultural transmission, and gradual assimilation processes that varied significantly based on local circumstances and pre-existing population dynamics. The enduring military legacy of Cimmerian warfare continued to profoundly influence tactical development throughout the ancient world for centuries after the complete disappearance of identifiable Cimmerian political entities and territorial control. The revolutionary cavalry tactics, sophisticated archery techniques, and innovative siege warfare methods systematically developed during their extensive campaigns provided crucial models that subsequent military forces adapted to their own strategic requirements and operational circumstances across diverse geographic environments. Archaeological evidence recovered from various ancient armies shows persistent use of weapons and specialized equipment designs that originated directly within Cimmerian military culture, demonstrating the lasting and transformative impact of their tactical innovations on military development across the entire Eurasian continent. These technological transfers establish precedents for combined arms operations and mobile warfare that influence military thinking from the Mediterranean to Central Asia for generations. The physical remains left behind by Cimmerian populations present one of the most challenging and complex puzzles in ancient Near Eastern archaeology, requiring sophisticated analytical techniques and interdisciplinary approaches to distinguish genuinely Cimmerian materials from the broader spectrum of nomadic cultures that swept across the Eurasian steppes during the turbulent Iron Age period. The inherent methodological difficulties in identifying specifically Cimmerian archaeological signatures have sparked decades of intensive scholarly debate regarding the proper ethnic attribution of excavated materials and their cultural significance. The geographic extent of Cimmerian territorial control and the precise duration of their presence in various regions across Anatolia and the Black Sea, littoral, remain subjects of ongoing archaeological investigation and scholarly interpretation. The Chernogorovka culture complex, centered in the strategic Dnieper Bend region of modern Ukraine, represents the most substantial and comprehensive body of archaeological evidence directly attributable to Proto-Cimmerian populations during their formative developmental period. Excavations conducted by Soviet and later Ukrainian archaeologists at crucial sites including Jabotin, Subatov, and Pereshchepino have systematically revealed stratified deposits spanning the critical transition period from the late Bronze Age through the early Iron Age, providing unprecedented insight into cultural transformation processes. These extensively studied sites contain distinctive artifact assemblages that skillfully combine traditional steppe burial practices with technological innovations in metallurgy and horse equipment that would later characterize classical period descriptions of Cimmerian military culture. The type site at Chernogorovka itself, excavated comprehensively during the 1950s and 1960s under the expert direction of A.I. Terenozhkin, yielded over 200 individual burials arranged in both traditional Kurgan mounds and flat grave cemeteries that demonstrate evolving social hierarchies within developing Cimmerian society. The primary burial in Kurgan 524 contained an adult male warrior interred with a complete iron sword featuring the distinctive crossguard design later associated with Cimmerian warriors throughout their territorial range. Associated burial goods included bronze horse bits with elaborate zoomorphic decorations, reflecting sophisticated artistic traditions, and over 150 bronze arrowheads displaying the characteristic three-bladed socketed construction that would become standard throughout the steppe region. Metallurgical analysis of iron artifacts from Chernogorovka sites reveals sophisticated understanding of carburization techniques that produced weapons with hardened cutting edges and flexible cores, specifically optimized for mounted combat applications. Spectrographic analysis conducted on sword blades from multiple burial contexts indicates consistent iron sources and manufacturing techniques, suggesting centralized production facilities capable of equipping substantial military forces with standardized equipment that maintained quality control across large-scale operations. The exceptional technical quality of these early iron weapons significantly exceeds contemporary examples from most sedentary civilizations, demonstrating that nomadic smiths had achieved metallurgical capabilities that provided decisive tactical advantages in warfare. The specialized horse equipment recovered from Chernogorovka sites provides crucial evidence for reconstructing Cimmerian cavalry capabilities and military organization that enabled their remarkable battlefield success. Bronze bits from elite burials feature complex leverage mechanisms with precisely jointed mouthpieces designed to provide maximum control during rapid battlefield maneuvers, while decorative elements incorporate stylized animal motifs that reflect developing artistic traditions distinct from earlier steppe cultures. Wear patterns on bit components indicate intensive use by trained cavalry mounts, supporting textual evidence for the superior horsemanship that characterized Cimmerian military effectiveness against traditional infantry-based opponents. Ceramic assemblages from Chernogorovka contexts display distinctive decorative schemes that combine geometric patterns with stylized representations of horses, weapons, and human figures engaged in combat activities that reflect the martial culture that defined Cimmerian society. The remarkable standardization of pottery forms and decorative motifs across multiple widely separated sites suggests shared cultural traditions and possibly centralized production systems that maintained artistic continuity across the broader Cimmerian territorial range. Petrographic analysis of ceramic fabrics indicates local clay sources but consistent manufacturing techniques, supporting theories of population mobility combined with technological standardization that enabled cultural unity despite geographic dispersion. The spectacular Novocherkassk treasure, discovered in 1939 near Rostov-on-Don, represents one of the most significant archaeological finds associated with Cimmerian material culture and provides crucial insight into their artistic achievements and economic capabilities. The hoard contained over 30 individual objects, including elaborately crafted gold and silver vessels, bronze cauldrons, iron weapons, and horse gear manufactured using techniques consistent with 7th century BCE Cimmerian workshops. The famous gold stag plaque from this assemblage displays artistic motifs that would later appear throughout the Scythian world, suggesting either cultural continuity between Cimmerian and Scythian populations or the systematic transmission of artistic traditions through conquest and assimilation processes. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials from Novocherkassk contexts provides crucial chronological anchors for understanding the transition from Cimmerian to Scythian cultural dominance in the North Pontic region. Calibrated dates ranging from 720 to 650 BCE correspond precisely with historical accounts of Scythian expansion and Cimmerian displacement preserved in Assyrian cuneiform sources and later Greek historical traditions. The remarkable correspondence between archaeological and textual chronologies strengthens arguments for the historical reliability of ancient sources regarding nomadic population movements during the early Iron Age. Archaeological investigations at Anatolian sites have systematically revealed evidence for Cimmerian presence that complements and confirms textual sources describing their military campaigns against established kingdoms in the region. Excavations at Sardis, the Lydian capital, have uncovered extensive destruction layers containing thousands of three-bladed arrowheads, characteristic of steppe nomadic warfare, along with clear evidence of systematic fire damage to administrative and residential districts that corresponds with historical accounts of Cimmerian siege operations during the mid-7th century BCE. The lower city area at Sardis shows particularly clear evidence of violent destruction, with collapsed mud brick walls containing embedded arrowheads and scattered bronze weapons that indicate fierce fighting in residential neighbourhoods. The distribution pattern of military artifacts suggests systematic house-to-house combat rather than simple raiding, supporting textual evidence that Cimmerian forces had developed sophisticated urban warfare capabilities adapted from their traditional nomadic tactics. Stratigraphic analysis indicates that the destruction occurred rapidly with minimal evidence of reconstruction activities before the site was abandoned for several decades, suggesting that Cimmerian attacks achieved their strategic objectives of eliminating political resistance and disrupting urban economic activities. Excavations at Gordion, the former Phrygian capital, have revealed similar destruction evidence dating to approximately 676 BCE, with extensive fire damage throughout the citadel area and numerous arrowheads of types consistent with Cimmerian military equipment. The famous Midas Mound burial shows evidence of disturbance during antiquity, with scattered grave goods and damaged wooden furniture that may indicate systematic looting during the Cimmerian assault. However, the preservation of substantial burial assemblages suggests that the destruction was not completely comprehensive, possibly indicating that Cimmerian forces were primarily interested in eliminating political resistance rather than total urban destruction. The complex methodological challenges involved in distinguishing Cimmerian archaeological materials from those of other steppe cultures reflect fundamental problems in prehistoric archaeology regarding ethnic identification and cultural attribution in mobile societies. The material culture similarities between different nomadic populations combined with the mobility that characterizes steppe societies create overlapping artifact distributions that resist simple ethnic classification based solely on material remains. Archaeological assemblages from the North Pontic region show gradual transitions rather than sharp cultural breaks, indicating complex processes of cultural interaction and demographic mixing that significantly complicate efforts to identify specific ethnic groups through material evidence alone. Comparative analysis of burial practices across the steppe region reveals both continuities and innovations that may reflect Cimmerian cultural contributions to broader nomadic traditions. The increased frequency of elaborate horse sacrifices in 8th and 7th century BC contexts corresponds chronologically with the period of Cimmerian political prominence, suggesting possible ritual innovations that spread through cultural contact and military conquest. However, similar practices appear in contemporary Central Asian contexts, indicating that ritual developments may have reflected broader cultural trends rather than specifically Cimmerian innovations. Weapon typology provides one of the most reliable methods for identifying Cimmerian archaeological signatures, as the distinctive sword and arrowhead designs associated with their military culture show consistent characteristics across widely separated geographic contexts. The Akinakis sword type, with its characteristic straight blade and distinctive crossguard design, appears in archaeological contexts from the North Pontic steppes to Anatolia and the Caucasus region during the 7th century BCE. Metallurgical analysis reveals consistent manufacturing techniques and design specifications that suggest either centralized production facilities or systematic transmission of technical knowledge across Cimmerian territorial ranges. Arrowhead typology offers particularly precise chronological and cultural markers, as the three-bladed socketed design characteristic of Cimmerian archery equipment shows distinctive manufacturing details that differentiate it from similar types produced by other steppe cultures. Statistical analysis of arrowhead dimensions from multiple archaeological contexts reveals standardized proportions that suggest quality control mechanisms and possibly centralized production facilities capable of mass production. The geographic distribution of these standardized types corresponds closely with historical accounts of Cimmerian military activities, providing archaeological confirmation of textual sources. The integration of archaeological and textual evidence requires careful consideration of the limitations and biases inherent in both types of sources that can distort historical interpretation. Ancient historical accounts primarily preserved in Assyrian cuneiform archives and later Greek literary sources reflect the perspectives of sedentary civilizations confronting nomadic military pressure, and may not accurately represent Cimmerian society and culture from internal viewpoints. Archaeological evidence provides direct access to material culture, but cannot illuminate political structures, religious beliefs, or social relationships that left no physical traces in the archaeological record. Assyrian royal inscriptions and administrative documents provide the most contemporary and detailed accounts of Cimmerian military activities, though their focus on imperial concerns limits their utility for understanding nomadic society and culture. The Annals of Sargon II describe encounters with Cimmeri forces during campaigns in the Caucasus region, providing specific details about Cimmerian military tactics, equipment, and political organization that can be compared with archaeological evidence from contemporary sites. However, the propagandistic nature of royal inscriptions requires careful analysis to separate factual information from rhetorical embellishment designed to glorify royal achievements and justify imperial policies. Administrative correspondence from Assyrian provincial archives offers more objective information about Cimmerian activities, as these documents were intended for internal governmental use rather than public propaganda, providing insight into the practical challenges of managing frontier territories under nomadic pressure. Letters from frontier governors systematically describe Cimmerian raid patterns, seasonal movement cycles, and complex diplomatic negotiations that provide invaluable insights into nomadic political structures and strategic objectives that would otherwise remain completely unknown to modern scholarship. The remarkable geographic specificity of these administrative reports enables direct correlation with archaeological evidence from sites specifically mentioned in the correspondence, substantially strengthening arguments for the historical accuracy of administrative sources that might otherwise be dismissed as unreliable or biased. Greek historical sources, primarily Herodotus and later classical authors, preserve extensive traditions regarding Cimmerian origins and activities that derive from multiple diverse sources, including Persian imperial archives, Scythian oral traditions maintained across generations, and Greek colonial experiences accumulated through centuries of direct contact in the Black Sea region. The considerable temporal distance between the events described and their eventual recording in written sources creates obvious reliability concerns that scholars must address, but the general consistency between Greek accounts and contemporary Assyrian sources suggests that substantial factual content was successfully preserved through complex oral transmission processes. Herodotus's comprehensive account of Scythian-Cimmerian conflicts provides detailed information about population movements and territorial boundaries that can be systematically tested against archaeological evidence from the North Pontic region through careful correlation of textual descriptions with material remains. His description of Cimmerian burial practices, political organization, and material culture shows remarkable correspondence with archaeological findings from sites like Chernogorovka and Novocherkassk, suggesting access to reliable informants with direct knowledge of nomadic traditions maintained through oral transmission. However, his well-documented tendency to incorporate mythological elements and moral lessons designed to educate his audience requires careful source criticism to identify historically accurate information embedded within literary elaboration. The linguistic evidence for Cimmerian ethnic identity presents particular challenges due to the complete absence of written records in the Cimmerian language and the extremely limited survival of Cimmerian linguistic elements in later sources from various cultural traditions. Comparative linguistic analysis suggests possible connections to both Thracian and Iranian language families, but the evidence remains insufficient for definitive classification that would resolve ongoing scholarly debates about Cimmerian ethnic origins and cultural affiliations. Place names preserved in the North Pontic region may contain Cimmerian linguistic elements, though distinguishing these from later Scythian or other nomadic contributions requires sophisticated philological analysis that remains highly controversial among linguistic specialists. Modern scholarly debates regarding Cimmerian ethnicity reflect broader theoretical issues in prehistoric archaeology and ancient history concerning the complex relationship between material culture patterns and ethnic identity formation in mobile societies. Some scholars argue for a broad definition of Cimmerian identity that encompasses various nomadic groups sharing similar material culture traditions and lifestyle patterns, while others advocate for more restrictive definitions based on specific archaeological signatures and historical documentation. These fundamental definitional disagreements significantly influence interpretations of archaeological evidence and assessments of Cimmerian historical significance in ancient Near Eastern development. The migration patterns attributed to Cimmerian populations have generated extensive scholarly discussion regarding the mechanisms and chronology of nomadic population movements during the early Iron Age that reshaped political landscapes across 3 continents. Archaeological evidence supports general southward and westward movement from the North Pontic steppes toward Anatolia and the Caucasus, but the specific routes, precise timing, and demographic scale of these movements remain contentious issues dividing scholarly opinion. Some scholars argue for massive population displacements involving entire tribal confederations with their livestock and material possessions, while others propose more limited movements of military elites who established political control over existing sedentary populations. The historical impact of Cimmerian activities continues to generate scholarly debate regarding their significance in broader patterns of ancient Near Eastern political and cultural development that shaped subsequent civilizational trajectories. Traditional interpretations emphasize the destructive effects of nomadic invasions on established civilizations, citing the complete destruction of Phrygian power and the systematic disruption of regional trade networks as evidence of profound Cimmerian historical importance. More recent scholarship has questioned this interpretation, arguing that Cimmerian activities represented responses to existing political instabilities rather than primary causes of civilizational collapse that occurred independently of nomadic pressure. Archaeological evidence from destruction layers at sites like Sardis and Gordion provides clear documentation of violent conflict during the 7th century BCE, but determining the specific role of Cimmerian forces in these events requires careful analysis of stratigraphic contexts and artifact assemblages. The presence of distinctively Cimmerian-type arrowheads in destruction layers indicates their direct participation in military activities but does not necessarily prove that they were the primary agents of destruction, rather than opportunistic participants in conflicts initiated by other causes. Local political conflicts and other military forces may have contributed to urban destruction that has been attributed primarily to Cimmerian activities based on incomplete evidence. The technological innovations associated with Cimmerian material culture had lasting influence on military development throughout Eurasia, though assessing their specific contributions requires distinguishing Cimmerian innovations from parallel developments in other nomadic cultures operating during the same period. The sophisticated ironworking techniques evident in Cimmerian weapons influenced metallurgical traditions throughout the steppe region and beyond, while their cavalry equipment designs provided crucial models that were systematically adopted by sedentary civilizations seeking to develop effective mounted warfare capabilities. The artistic traditions preserved in Cimmerian metalwork and decorative objects contributed significantly to the development of animal-style art that would later characterize Scythian and other nomadic cultures throughout the Eurasian steppes for centuries. The stylized animal motifs and geometric patterns found on objects from sites like Novocherkassk show clear continuities with later artistic traditions, suggesting either direct cultural transmission or the establishment of artistic conventions that influence subsequent cultural development. However, determining the specific Cimmerian contribution to these artistic traditions requires careful analysis of chronological sequences and cultural contexts that remain incompletely understood despite decades of intensive research. The demographic legacy of Cimmerian populations in regions where they established temporary or permanent settlements continues to interest scholars studying ancient population genetics and ethnic formation processes that shaped regional development. While direct genetic evidence remains limited due to the poor preservation of organic materials in many archaeological contexts, comparative analysis of material culture suggests that Cimmerian groups contributed to the ethnic composition of various Anatolian and Caucasian populations through intermarriage and cultural assimilation processes that occurred over several centuries of gradual integration. The gradual disappearance of identifiable Cimmerian political entities from the historical record during the early 6th century BCE marked not the end of their influence, but rather the beginning of a remarkable transformation that would see these once feared nomadic warriors evolve from concrete historical actors into legendary figures whose reputation would echo through millennia of subsequent literature, scholarship, and popular imagination that continues to this day. The process by which historical Cimmerians became systematically mythologized began almost immediately after their political fragmentation, as Greek authors sought to make sense of the devastating conflicts that had reshaped the ancient Near Eastern world during the turbulent 7th century BCE. Herodotus, writing in the mid-5th century BCE, already demonstrates the complex relationship between historical memory and legendary elaboration that would characterize all subsequent treatments of Cimmerian peoples in classical and later literature. His account in the Histories presents Cimmerians as both concrete historical actors whose military campaigns could be dated and located with reasonable precision, and as representatives of primordial forces from the mysterious northern regions beyond the boundaries of civilized knowledge and geographic understanding. This dual characterization established an interpretive template that later authors would consistently follow, treating Cimmerians simultaneously as documented historical peoples and as symbols of barbaric power emanating from the world's dark peripheries. The geographic associations that developed around Cimmerian peoples in Greek literature contributed significantly to their progressive mythologization in ways that obscured historical realities. Homer's references in the Odyssey to Cimmerians dwelling in perpetual darkness at the edges of the known world created powerful poetic imagery that subsequent authors found irresistible even when dealing with historically documented Cimmerian activities. The conflation of historical Cimmerians with Homeric literary traditions produced composite portraits that combined factual military achievements with supernatural characteristics derived from epic poetry that prioritized artistic impact over historical accuracy. This literary synthesis proved remarkably durable, influencing European conceptions of northern peoples for over 2 millennia. Roman authors inherited Greek literary traditions regarding Cimmerians, but adapted them to serve different cultural and political purposes within the expanding imperial context that emphasized Roman superiority over barbarian peoples. Strabo's geography attempts to reconcile conflicting Greek sources regarding Cimmerian origins and activities, but his systematic approach reveals the extent to which legendary materials had already contaminated historical traditions by the 1st century BCE. His careful distinction between historical and mythical Cimmerians acknowledges the interpretive problem, while simultaneously perpetuating it, as his own account incorporates elements from both categories, without clear methodological criteria for distinguishing reliable from unreliable information. The Roman fascination with barbarian peoples as foils for civilized society found perfect expression in Cimmerian legends, which provided examples of primitive military prowess that both threatened and validated imperial expansion. Tacitus and other imperial historians systematically used Cimmerian examples to illustrate the civilizing mission of Roman conquest, portraying nomadic warfare as representing an earlier stage of human development that Roman military discipline and political organization had successfully transcended. This interpretive framework transformed historical Cimmerian military achievements into cautionary tales about the dangers of uncontrolled barbarian power, while simultaneously celebrating Roman superiority over such primitive forces. The transmission of Cimmerian legends through late antique and early medieval sources created additional layers of interpretation that further obscured historical realities through theological and moral frameworks. Christian authors found in Cimmerian stories useful examples of divine judgment against pagan civilizations, interpreting nomadic invasions as instruments of providential punishment for moral corruption and spiritual wickedness. This theological framework encouraged the preservation of Cimmerian traditions while transforming their significance from historical documentation to moral instruction, creating narrative structures that emphasize supernatural causation over political and military analysis. Byzantine historical traditions maintained awareness of Cimmerian peoples through their careful preservation of classical sources, but the geographic displacement of the Eastern Roman Empire from traditional Cimmerian territorial ranges reduced direct cultural memory of nomadic activities in Anatolia and the Black Sea region. The focus of Byzantine attention on contemporary steppe peoples, including various Turkic and Mongolic groups, created comparative frameworks that interpreted historical Cimmerians as predecessors of more recent nomadic threats. This comparative approach preserved some accurate information about nomadic warfare methods, while embedding it within an anachronistic political and cultural context that distorted historical understanding. Medieval European knowledge of Cimmerian peoples derived primarily from classical literary sources, rather than direct historical investigation, creating opportunities for creative elaboration that reflected contemporary concerns rather than ancient realities. The Crusading period's emphasis on conflicts between Christian and non-Christian peoples provided interpretive frameworks that cast historical Cimmerians as early examples of barbarian threats to civilized society. Chronicle writers incorporated Cimmerian references as historical precedents for contemporary conflicts, using ancient examples to legitimize military campaigns against various nomadic peoples threatening European frontiers. The Renaissance revival of classical learning brought renewed scholarly attention to ancient sources regarding Cimmerian peoples, but humanist approaches to historical interpretation often prioritized literary elegance over factual accuracy. The development of systematic philological methods enabled more sophisticated analysis of ancient texts, but the absence of archaeological evidence meant that textual criticism remained the primary tool for understanding Cimmerian history. This methodological limitation encouraged continued reliance on literary sources that had already incorporated substantial legendary materials, perpetuating earlier confusions between historical and mythological elements. The emergence of comparative historical methods during the Enlightenment created new possibilities for understanding Cimmerian peoples within broader patterns of nomadic migration and cultural interaction across Eurasian landscapes. Edward Gibbon's treatment of barbarian invasions in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire established analytical frameworks that interpreted Cimmerian activities as early examples of recurring historical patterns involving nomadic pressure on sedentary civilizations. This comparative approach provided valuable insights into the structural factors underlying nomadic sedentary conflicts, while sometimes obscuring the specific historical circumstances that shaped Cimmerian activities. The development of scientific archaeology during the 19th century promised to resolve long-standing debates about Cimmerian history through systematic excavation and material analysis that could provide objective evidence independent of literary sources. Early archaeological investigations in the Black Sea region uncovered substantial evidence for Iron Age nomadic cultures, but the methodological limitations of 19th century excavation techniques and the absence of reliable chronological frameworks made it difficult to distinguish specifically Cimmerian materials from those of other steppe peoples operating during the same period. The persistent tendency to attribute impressive archaeological discoveries to historically documented peoples sometimes led to overconfident identifications that subsequent researchers systematically questioned or completely abandoned as methodological standards improved and chronological frameworks became more sophisticated. Russian and Soviet archaeological programs conducted throughout the North Pontic region during the 20th century produced unprecedented quantities of data regarding Iron Age steppe cultures, including substantial materials that could be plausibly associated with historical Cimmerian populations through careful analysis of artifact assemblages and site contexts. The systematic excavation of crucial sites like Chernogorovka and the comprehensive analysis of burial complexes throughout Ukraine provided concrete evidence for reconstructing nomadic society and culture during the pivotal 8th and 7th centuries BCE through detailed study of material remains and cultural practices. However, the political context within which this research occurred sometimes encouraged interpretations that emphasized ethnic continuity and territorial claims rather than objective historical analysis, guided purely by archaeological evidence. The most dramatic and culturally significant transformation of Cimmerian historical memory occurred through their adoption by modern popular culture, beginning with Robert E. Howard's groundbreaking creation of Conan the Cimmerian during the 1930s, which fundamentally altered popular perceptions of these ancient peoples. Howard's fictional Cimmeria bore virtually no resemblance to historical Cimmerian society, drawing instead on romantic conceptions of primitive barbarian nobility that reflected contemporary American cultural concerns about industrialization and modernity rather than ancient realities documented in archaeological and textual sources. The enormous commercial popularity of Howard's stories created a version of Cimmerian identity that completely overshadowed genuine historical knowledge in popular consciousness, establishing character types and narrative patterns that continue to influence fantasy literature, gaming, and other media forms throughout the modern world. Howard's Cimmerians represented a creative synthesis of various cultural elements drawn from Celtic, Germanic, and other European traditions, rather than any serious attempt to reconstruct historical nomadic society based on available evidence. The emphasis on individual heroism, primitive virtue, and romantic resistance to civilized decadence reflected distinctly modern concerns about industrial society and cultural authenticity, rather than ancient nomadic values or social structures that can be reconstructed through careful historical analysis. This creative transformation demonstrated the remarkable flexibility of historical memory, showing how ancient names and associations could be completely reimagined to serve contemporary cultural purposes entirely divorced from their original contexts. The enduring influence of Howard's fictional Cimmerians on subsequent fantasy literature established narrative conventions that continue to shape popular representations of ancient nomadic peoples across multiple media platforms and cultural contexts. The archetypal barbarian warrior, combining extraordinary physical prowess with moral integrity and natural wisdom, became a standard character type that appears throughout modern fantasy fiction, role-playing games, and visual media productions worldwide. These fictional representations often incorporate superficial elements derived from various historical nomadic cultures, but the specific association with Cimmerian peoples reflects Howard's creative legacy rather than historical documentation or archaeological evidence. contemporary historical fiction dealing with ancient nomadic peoples faces the ongoing challenge of distinguishing between historically plausible reconstructions and popular mythologies that have become deeply embedded in cultural consciousness through decades of creative elaboration. Authors attempting to portray historical Cimmerians must carefully navigate between archaeological evidence that remains incomplete and controversial, classical sources that combine factual information with legendary materials, and popular expectations shaped by decades of fantasy literature that bears little resemblance to historical realities. This creative challenge reflects broader issues in historical fiction regarding the delicate balance between scholarly accuracy and popular accessibility in representing ancient peoples and cultures to modern audiences. The lasting impact of Cimmerian military innovations on ancient warfare development represents perhaps their most significant and enduring historical legacy, extending far beyond the immediate chronological and geographical boundaries of their political activities to influence military thinking across multiple civilizations. The tactical integration of mounted archery with coordinated cavalry maneuvers that characterize Cimmerian military effectiveness provided crucial models that influenced military development throughout Eurasia for centuries after the complete disappearance of identifiable Cimmerian political entities. Archaeological evidence recovered from diverse cultural contexts reveals weapons designs, tactical equipment, and military practices that can be directly traced to innovations first developed within Cimmerian military culture through careful analysis of technological transmission and cultural exchange. The composite bow technology that enabled Cimmerian archery superiority spread through extensive trade networks and military contacts to influence weapon development from Mediterranean coastal regions to Central Asian steppelands. The sophisticated understanding of material science and engineering principles required for effective composite bow construction created technical knowledge that was systematically transmitted through craft traditions and military exchanges long after its original cultural context had completely disappeared from historical memory. Archaeological analysis of bow fragments from sites throughout the ancient world reveals construction techniques and design principles that derive directly from innovations first documented in Cimmerian contexts. Cavalry tactics systematically developed by Cimmerian military leaders provided foundational concepts that subsequent nomadic and sedentary armies adapted to their own strategic requirements and cultural contexts with remarkable success. The coordination of mounted archery with precisely timed close combat cavalry charges created tactical possibilities that required fundamental changes in military training, equipment design, and battlefield organization that influenced warfare development for centuries. The influence of these tactical innovations can be systematically traced through military developments in Persian, Greek, Roman, and various Central Asian armies that incorporated essential elements derived from original Cimmerian military practices adapted to local conditions. The metallurgical techniques that produced superior Cimmerian weapons influenced iron-working traditions throughout the ancient world through various forms of technological transfer and cultural exchange that spread technical knowledge across vast distances. The sophisticated understanding of differential heat treatment, pattern welding, and alloy composition that characterized Cimmerian weapon production created technical standards that subsequent smiths sought to match or exceed through careful study and experimentation. Archaeological evidence from weapon production sites across Eurasia reveals manufacturing techniques and quality control methods that derive from innovations first developed within nomadic military cultures. Horse breeding programs initiated by Cimmerian peoples to produce mounts specifically optimized for warfare created genetic lineages that influenced equine development throughout the ancient world through systematic selective breeding. The selective breeding techniques that produced horses capable of carrying armoured riders across extended distances while maintaining speed and manoeuvrability required sophisticated understanding of equine genetics and behaviour that represented remarkable scientific achievement. The influence of these breeding programs can be traced through archaeological analysis of horse remains from sites throughout Eurasia, revealing morphological characteristics that derive from bloodlines first developed within steppe nomadic cultures. The siege warfare techniques that Cimmerian forces developed through their extensive campaigns against fortified urban centres contributed to military engineering knowledge that influenced subsequent developments in both offensive and defensive technologies. The adaptation of traditional nomadic mobility advantages to the demanding requirements of sustained siege operations created tactical innovations that were carefully studied and adopted by various sedentary armies seeking to improve their own capabilities. Archaeological evidence from fortification sites throughout Anatolia and the Near East reveals defensive modifications that reflect responses to siege techniques first employed by nomadic forces. The intelligence gathering and reconnaissance capabilities that enabled crucial Cimmerian strategic advantages provided organizational models that influenced military development throughout the ancient world by demonstrating the importance of systematic information collection. The systematic collection and analysis of information regarding enemy capabilities, terrain features, and political developments required institutional structures that transcended traditional nomadic social organization. The demonstrated effectiveness of these intelligence systems encouraged their adoption by sedentary armies, seeking to improve their strategic planning and tactical coordination capabilities through better information management. The integration of different ethnic and cultural groups within Cimmerian military formations created organizational precedents that influenced subsequent developments in military recruitment and command structures across multiple civilizations. The successful coordination of diverse tribal contingents under unified command required administrative innovations that balanced central authority with respect for traditional autonomy and cultural practices that different groups valued. These organizational solutions provided models that were systematically adapted by various imperial armies, seeking to incorporate diverse populations within unified military structures without destroying their effectiveness. The diplomatic and political strategies that Cimmerian leaders employed in their complex interactions with sedentary civilizations contributed to the development of international relations concepts that influenced subsequent political developments throughout the ancient world. The successful negotiation of tribute arrangements, military alliances, and territorial agreements required sophisticated understanding of comparative political systems and cultural differences that demonstrated remarkable diplomatic sophistication. The precedents established through these diplomatic activities provided frameworks that subsequent nomadic and sedentary peoples adapted to their own political requirements and international relationships. As we reach the conclusion of this comprehensive examination of Cimmerian history, it becomes clear that their legacy extends far beyond the immediate chronological boundaries of their political existence to encompass lasting influences on military, cultural, and political development across multiple civilizations. From their origins in the North Pontic steppes through their dramatic military campaigns across Anatolia and the Near East, the Cimmerians represent a crucial link in the chain of cultural transmission that connected the nomadic world with sedentary civilizations throughout antiquity. Their military innovations, political strategies, and cultural practices created precedents that influenced human development long after their own society had disappeared from historical records. The transformation from historical actors into legendary figures demonstrates the remarkable durability of cultural memory and the complex processes through which ancient peoples continue to influence modern consciousness through literature, scholarship, and popular imagination. The gap between historical reality and cultural memory reveals how societies construct meaning from the past to serve contemporary purposes, creating narratives that may bear little resemblance to original events, but serve important cultural functions. The archaeological evidence painstakingly recovered from sites across the former Cimmerian homeland provides our most reliable access to their actual society and culture, revealing sophisticated military organization, advanced technological capabilities, and complex social structures that challenge simplistic characterizations of nomadic peoples as primitive or barbaric. The material remains demonstrate that Cimmerian society achieved remarkable sophistication in metallurgy, cavalry warfare, and political organization that enabled their small population to challenge the greatest empires of their age. The textual sources, despite their limitations and biases, preserve crucial information about Cimmerian activities and their impact on contemporary civilizations that would otherwise be lost to historical memory. The combination of archaeological and textual evidence provides a foundation for understanding Cimmerian history that transcends the limitations of either source type alone, while acknowledging the gaps and uncertainties that inevitably characterize our knowledge of ancient peoples. The scholarly debates surrounding Cimmerian ethnicity, migration patterns, and historical significance reflect broader theoretical issues in archaeology and ancient history regarding identity, cultural change, and the relationship between material culture and social organization. These debates demonstrate the complexity of reconstructing ancient societies from fragmentary evidence while highlighting the importance of methodological rigor in historical interpretation. The modern legacy of the Cimmerians encompasses both scholarly understanding, based on careful analysis of evidence, and popular cultural representations that serve different purposes in contemporary society. The tension between historical accuracy and cultural creativity reveals how ancient peoples continue to live in modern consciousness through processes of memory, interpretation, and imagination that transform historical figures into cultural symbols. The Cimmerians ultimately achieved a form of immortality that their greatest warriors could never have imagined, living on not merely in archaeological remains and ancient texts, but in the collective imagination of humanity itself, forever embodying the fierce independence and martial prowess of the nomadic peoples who shaped the ancient world. Their legacy demonstrates that historical impact cannot be measured solely through political duration or territorial control, but must account for cultural influences that transcend chronological boundaries and continue to shape human consciousness across millennia.